A lesson I will learn one day, huh?
Be quiet, let the wife do it.
You're a smart man.
Yeah. Sure, wife members.
Yeah. Yeah, we hit a high of somewhere around 80 yesterday, 80 something yesterday, which I thought was pretty good.
Could have been better.
Yeah, it's true. And there was a wreck on one, they said 155.
Down in Winona, yeah. They were talking about at the restaurant this morning. Said some guy went through there. It's a 40-mile-an-hour zone, or 30-mile-an-hour zone. He was going through there about 65 and lost it.
We're good. Welcome to the Bible Sabbath Association Fellowship Meeting of 2019. We're now about to start our next session, but before we start our next session with Bill Watson from the Church of God International, we want to have Royce Mitchell with the Bible Sabbath Association. He's actually the editor of our magazine, The Sabbath Sentinel. We want to have him give an opening prayer.
Heavenly Father, we give you the thanks for all the things that you do for us, for all the blessings you bestow on us in our lives, the way you watch over us, protect us, the way you give us a path to walk in, the way you give us brethren to walk the path with us, to help keep us on the straight and the narrow, the path that leads to you. We give you the honor and the glory for all those things. Father, we praise you for the Bible Sabbath Association as well, for an organization that tries to reach out between the different organizations and to show the ways that we are alike, not the ways that we're different. We all too often want to focus on those things, Father, because we're human. We want to see where we're right and someone else is wrong. But yet, Father, when we think about it, we're all wrong, and you're right. And we need to remember that. So we thank you for that wisdom and that understanding. Father, we commit the rest of this conference today into your hands, asking for you to open our minds to understand, open our hearts so that we can accept our brethren for who they are and for their level of development, and strengthen us in our walk, Father, with that understanding. So we do commit the conference in your hands. We ask your presence here with us, praying it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Now we want to welcome Brother Bill Watson with the Church of God International. Come on up, my brother. He's going to be talking about CGI work in Jamaica. Well, I'm really excited to hear about this because Jamaica has, outside of Israel, the highest per capita of Sabbatarians in the world. So come on up, my brother.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody, and those of you on the internet, welcome to our services. Today, the sessions that we're going to be conducting, good to have all of you with us as well. So it is our pleasure to be with you on this first day of the week. And nice day it is here in Tyler, Texas, or not Tyler, I guess. We're in Big Sandy, actually, so that's more appropriate or more accurate. But I wanted to take some time, as Kelly was mentioning today, to just kind of review specifically a little bit of what the Church of God in particular is doing in the area of the Caribbean as well as Jamaica specifically. And then I'm going to take a little bit of time at the end to illustrate a little bit of what the Church of God International is doing on a broader worldwide scale in terms of our efforts in trying to evangelize and continue to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ with all of the products and different venues that we're trying to implement to attract a broader variety of people that are out there in, as we've said before, as I've said before, the field of our evangelism, the unconverted world, because we're really not interested in trying to attract individuals that are already in what we believe to be an administration of the Church of God. Our concerns are trying to spread this gospel to new folks, new minds, and those are some of the, what you could say, priorities that we're looking at in an attempt to try to advance this work as well as exposure of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I wanted to take a moment here to just kind of give you some backdrop context that might help you a little bit to understand how far we've come, because in knowing where we started from and then going where we're going to go will help you to be able to gauge that. The Church of God International, many of you may know, maybe not, but was actually born out of pain. Ron Dart used that terminology many years ago to illustrate just exactly our origins, our beginnings, because frankly, it was indeed out of necessity because Garner Ted Armstrong was terminated in the Worldwide Church of God, if the truth were known, probably in the late 1977, and then ultimately and officially in 1978, that drove him to incorporate the Church of God International here in the state of Texas on July 21st, 1978. And so from that point, we proceeded then to grow this particular administration of the Church of God. Over the ensuing years, and in the beginning as we came out of the box, it was slow going. And Garner Ted Armstrong attempted to focus on radio primarily, building an audience from that medium in the beginning years, 79, 80, and so forth, until finally, once exceeding about, believe it or not, around 50 plus stations on the radio, they opted, with enough income now being generated over a period of 2 to 3 years, they opted to go ahead and purchase television time. And so consequently, from that point on, he went on to TV. And that just compounded things. As a matter of fact, that's where I finally found myself being exposed to the Church of God International's ministry in Akron, Ohio, back in about 80, 81 or so, I think it was. Maybe 82, I don't know exactly, but yeah, I think, matter of fact, it was 82, because my wife and I, in the Worldwide Church, were becoming somewhat suspicious of some changes that were going on, and as a result, went ahead and proceeded to kind of engage in what you could say a revisitation of our own roots and our own origins that drove us to the connection of the Church of God back in 1971. So in 79, when Herbert Armstrong started changing the makeup rule and came on strong with this primacy of Peter, and us going back looking at our old correspondence courses, knowing we weren't taught that stuff, started suspecting, hey, something is going on. But like good members of the church, we thought it was us and we were having a bad attitude. But at any rate, after searching and going to the Willamette Valley and down to Salem, West Virginia, investigating and making sure, using Herbert Armstrong's autobiography as our GPS and our map, we proceeded to confirm many of the things that was in that book, and I'm here to say were indeed confirmed, and consequently afforded us at least some substantiation and legitimization of what we were involved with. But at any rate, the work of the Church of God International continued, as I was mentioning, through radio to begin with, and then ultimately on television. And from the area of Jamaica, of which I want to specifically kind of now turn to, there was really not any indication of anything of substance going on there, other than some letters coming into the home office in Tyler, Texas, requesting literature and the normal things that would indicate to us that apparently some people are listening. Well, surprisingly, and we didn't even recognize this, but Mr. Armstrong went ahead and arranged for, in 1987, a personal appearance campaign in the Kingston area to basically, as we would say, kick the bushes and see what comes out. And lo and behold, he landed there, did the campaign. 900 people showed up. Amazing. We were totally surprised. 900 folks showed up in 1987 to this campaign. Now, we didn't know anything was going on. We didn't know what kind of impact radio was having. We didn't know the little bit of television that we now started and commenced in probably about 83, 84, 85, what it was doing there in the island or in even the Caribbean area. So consequently, this was a real encouragement, number one, and a total surprise. It took us really back a little bit. So then in 1988, we decided to do another one. Immediately, the next year, we went ahead, and Bronson James, who was essentially operating as a regional overseer, coordinator, for lack of a better term, went down there with Mr. Armstrong again, because he was with him in 87 as well. Bronson James, a good colleague of mine, still with the Church of God International. Would like you all to know that he's having health challenges at this time in his life. His prayers for him would be greatly appreciated, quite frankly, and I'd like to put that all before you to keep him in your prayers. That's Mr. Bronson James. But at any rate, they went down there in 1988. Well, the Prince of the Power of the Air, I guess he had other ideas, and they got hit with Hurricane Gilbert. that was the end of that campaign. It never really happened, and consequently and unfortunately, we kind of swung and missed on that. However, with all that I'm saying here, not recognizing the impact, we didn't realize that as early as probably around 83 or so, a gentleman named Ian Boyne, commenced with actually conducting meetings in his home. And according to Horain Smith, a colleague of mine who's now pastoring the Toronto CGI congregation up in Canada and immigrated here to Canada in about 1992 or so, somewhere in that area, and was ordained just a few years back now into the ministry and serving Jesus Christ in this administration, went ahead and told me, basically in talking with him here just recently, that he actually attended a meeting in 1985 of 12 people sitting around a table listening to a cassette tape, audio only, not video, just audio, a cassette tape of tapes that he was getting from the home office in Tyler, Texas, combination of, I'm sure Larry Watkins, that's a name I think many of you may be familiar with, and or Ron Dart at that time, and of course Mr. Garner Ted Armstrong. So it was interesting to discover the fact that meetings were already being conducted by Mr. Ian Boyne, who was indeed conducting these meetings and consequently starting to get some things moved along a little bit on the island. In the meantime, Mr. Boyne began to speak in the late 80s publicly and started holding meetings and began to go ahead and hold these, what you could say, public Bible studies. Now, I don't know how many of you know Ian Boyne. I know Dixon knows him and was quite close to him, and Ian wrote quite a few articles for Dixon's newspaper in years gone by. But Ian was a very charismatic individual, very glib. He was a well-spoken guy, articulate, very dynamic. He was what I would call a debating apologist. I mean to tell you, when you got into a conversation with him, if you were of the opposite ilk, lo and behold, you better have your seatbelt fastened, because he could talk you around and around to where you wouldn't even know what you believed after you talked to him. He was that good. I mean, he was just an amazing guy, and he also had this unique gift about him whereby if you were talking to him face to face, he would always make you think you were the most important person in the world. I mean, there was just this warmth and connection that he could have with you because of his charismatic personality. Now, Ian, you have to understand, grew up in Jamaica. He's a native-born Jamaican and never really left the island. He had a kind of a phobia about airplanes and boats, never left the island. But he was a big fish in a small pond there in Jamaica. I say that because he was a journalist for the, I think it was the Jamaican, what was that, Dixon, the Jamaican? The Gleaner, that was the big one. That was the big one, the Gleaner. And he had articles in there, I mean, every week, op-eds and so forth. He was well known throughout the island. As a matter of fact, he conducted 2 half-hour television programs on Jamaica, and essentially one of them was called Profile. It went 30 years. He got an award. It was longer than Oprah Winfrey. I mean, he had a tremendous amount of notoriety on the island. When you walked with Ian Boyne throughout Jamaica into a hotel or something, you just wouldn't be surprised somebody would say, "Hey, Ian, how are you, Mr. Boyne? Hey, how are you doing, Mr. Boyne?" You know, everybody knew him. It was like a celebrity. He had a second program called Hard Talk. This was focused on religion. He would get Sunday keeping pastors, ministers, priests, whoever, and he would debate them. And I mean, they would go at it like a couple of cats on a hot tin roof. I mean, they were back and forth, and it was, I mean, you have to get into that culture. I've watched many of the programs down there when I was traveling and so forth. They'd be on easy on some of the days I was there, and it was quite entertaining and educational at the same time. Of course, the Jamaican culture, being high energy and so forth, was quite edifying in many respects. The other program, I don't want to miss anything on the other program called Profile. This one was what you could say the PR program of Jamaica. Anybody who was anybody went on this program. I don't care if it was the Queen of England, some celebrity entertainer, some politician from another country. Ian Boyne interviewed that person. They went on that program for a couple of reasons. One, of course, they wanted to introduce the individuals to Jamaica on a broad scale, and that program profile was virtually watched by many, many Jamaicans on the island. And so, case in point, I've always called Ian Boyne the Larry King of Jamaica, because he was just that popular. He was just a great guy, and a wonderful wonderful man, very, very charitable, and in many respects, as I say, very dynamic in his way of doing things. Sadly and unfortunately, he died. He passed away in December of the 18th of 2017. This book was in fact printed and published at his funeral. He was, for all intents and purposes, buried with dignitary honors. He was that well known. I've got a few bonus stories. I don't have any bonus slides like Kelly had yesterday, but I got a few bonus stories I want to mention to you here as I get along, if I get enough time to leave you with, that I would like to bring to your attention. But over here, out of this book, and I wanted to just mention this, this was a tribute in honor of the life of Ian Boyne, and I wanted to just take a moment out here to give him a bit of airtime to just illustrate to you that Ian Boyne was a man for all seasons, who exemplified professionalism in the execution of his duties at the Jamaican Information Service. That's JIS. That's a government service asset that the Jamaican government uses, and in his capacity of deputy chief executive officer and chief state liaison, he engaged everyone. His wholehearted dedication to excellence has left an indelible mark. He was an interviewer, he was a counselor, advocate, advisor, prolific, leader, astute, friend, and clever, extraordinary, distinguished, passionate, enterprising, competent, influential, respected, excellent, and talented. And amongst all that was a speechwriter for the prime ministers, multiple prime ministers throughout Jamaica. This man had quite a reputation. And consequently, I mention all of that to illustrate to you the obvious impact he had for the Church of God International over the years of his service as a pastor of the Kingston CGI congregation. And through the 90s, as he began to speak, he was not ordained in the early 90s. He wasn't really ordained around until the 2000s, but we gave him certainly the trust and the freedom to speak because it was obvious he was gifted in that way. And we had leadership down there in Jamaica. We had some gentlemen from the Worldwide Church of God who were with us as well. So we had some good, solid leadership throughout the 80s and the early 90s up until about the mid-90s. But during that time of the 80s, the late 80s, and to the mid-90s, Ian Boyne was a dynamic force for the Church of God International and God's work and the propagation of the gospel of Jesus Christ on that island and throughout the Caribbean as well, because his voice did go out beyond the borders of Jamaica. He didn't. Like I said, he wouldn't get on a boat and he wouldn't get on an airplane, but his voice did, and it did have quite an effect on many of the people throughout the Caribbean as they became more familiar with what he was talking about. Consequently, the Kingston congregation grew up to about 100 to 120 folk or so up in the early 90s, until finally we ended up having a bit of trouble and tension due to a couple of things that fed into some conflict there in the Kingston area, the Church of God International congregation specifically, and of which split the church due to these dynamics. And that does indeed happen from time to time, as we all sitting here know that. And sadly and unfortunately, it does sometimes have a way of purging individuals due to certain things that are going on that are not perhaps necessarily or compatible with the advancement of the work of Jesus Christ. Be that as it may, we continued to build in the area regardless, and Ian Boyne continued to do the public service that he was doing on behalf of Jesus Christ and the gospel, as well as the Church of God International's administration, and people began to come into the Church of God in really in many, many, many wholesale fashions. As time went on, in about 95 or so, when a lot of the tension was occurring, a gentleman named George Ramakan came into our audience. George Ramakan was a well-known, uniquely enough, a well-known Parliament member. He was retiring out of politics. This would be the equivalent of a senator or a congressman of sort. He too had notoriety. He too was somewhat of a celeb. He came out of the Conservative Party of Jamaica, and as a result came into our audience, came into our contact, and was moved to accept the Sabbath in 1995, and ended up getting baptized, and consequently later on he too became ordained into the Church of God, and as a result serving Jesus Christ, but also conceding to working with the Church of God International's administration. And so now we've got two dynamic personalities, because I don't know who's a better debater, George or Ian, because these two guys, I mean to tell you, they could talk. And a matter of fact, Ian would enjoy George's talent and gifts in being able to be a good debater and apologist, by the way, and would actually invite him on the religious program called Hard Talk. And so George would get on there, and I mean to tell you, he would take some of these Sunday keepers to task. But that's the culture, you see. You have to understand the culture, the Jamaican way of doing things. You talk about challenging and getting personal with somebody about, well, how can you think of that? How can you believe that when the Bible says this? And I'll tell you what, it was back and forth, but it got people really engaged. And as a result of this back and forth, the 2000s were really an amazing time of growth. With George now and Ian both, and much of the, what you could say, strong now leadership that was developing in the Jamaican Kingston congregation, primarily, we only had one congregation, and I got involved in around 2002. And as a result took the role of this regional coordinator, overseer, for lack of a better term, and together with the leadership down there in combination with Ian Boyne and George Ramakan, we all went ahead and continued to work that area until today, brethren, I'm happy to say, in Kingston, we have a congregation of about 200 to 250 people meeting in Kingston. Secondly, Spanish Town, because along the way we were able to get the attention of an independent Sabbath-keeping group who had a pastor and later on became qualified and quantified and vetted and essentially viewed by the ministry of the Church of God International to accept him into our fraternity and our administration as a minister, and now had three ministers in Jamaica, Pedro Hall of Spanish Town, George Ramakan, and Ian Boyne, all working together with the strong leadership out of the Kingston congregation to build these additional congregations. And of course, with Pedro coming on board where he pastored in Spanish Town, we have approximately 75 to 100 folks meeting every Sabbath down there, along with Ocho Rios of about 20 to 30 people, and another city way up in the mountains in the back hills, Maroon Town, where we've got 50 to 75 people meeting there every Sabbath on the high days as well, because they did indeed adopt the holy days. Even Pedro Hall adopted the holy days thereafter when he became acquainted with Ian Boyne, and he and Pedro went head to head like a couple of cats on a hot tin roof. And Pedro just said, "Enough's enough, Ian. You've got my agreement. I will keep the holy days." So it was quite an event and certainly quite an experience. And today I stand here with some really exciting news, because the phenomenal potential of what is going on in Jamaica, at least in our realm of work, in our administration of work, the Church of God Internationals, there is a lot of activity going forward with interests being born in the Church of God's Seventh Day primarily, where they're moving toward adopting and recognizing the holy days. And as a result, some congregations of the CG7, of which you have to understand are very autonomous in many respects, in Jamaica. Though they all carry CG7 identities and labels as that association to that particular administration, the fact of it is many of them are still very autonomous. So consequently, when you deal with a CG7 congregation in Jamaica, it's almost like dealing with a separate administration, if you know what I'm saying. But the fact of it is we're attracting many of these autonomous CG7 congregations into our fellowship, and today we have now approximately 2 or 3 of those congregations who are indeed sharing the Feast of Tabernacle Holy Day services that we conduct not only in one location on the island of Jamaica, but now for the last 3 years we have 2 feast sites. 2 feast sites in Jamaica, one in Portland, which is in the interior of Jamaica, kind of in the mountain area, and then the other one is in Ocho Rios, which is more of the coastal area and more of a, what you could say, tourist location for those feast sites. So it really has grown in the area, and the attraction to these potentials and the consequent involvement with the CG7 people that are showing interest in expanding their Hebrew roots and connecting up with additional things that they're not necessarily familiar with is really encouraging to see this actually happening in a real living dynamic like this. I had opportunity, sadly, at Ian's funeral when I was down there to meet the regional director for the CG7 group in Jamaica, and made his acquaintance, and we talked a little bit about some of the details that were going on, and he kind of just expressed an interest that it was certainly a curious thing that was happening, you know, and he wasn't really against it or anything. He was more or less open-minded in many respects. But these are some of the things that are going on, and it's interesting. I wanted to share now some bonus stories with you a little bit, because as much as we, Church of God International's attitude toward being encouraged over the progress and growth that we see happening over these years since 1987, when Mr. Armstrong conducted that first campaign where 900 people showed up. And by the way, we did take a third try in 1992, I think it was, or 93, and we had 700 people show up on that one. And fortunately, no hurricanes knocked that one out, so like in '88 with Hurricane Gilbert. But at any rate, even though, as I said, we were encouraged to see all of this growth, uniquely enough, one day when I was down there to marry Ian Boyne, and this is kind of a cute story, I was going ahead and landing, and I went through customs and so forth. Now, Ian Boyne was keeping his marriage on the QT. And Ian Boyne, being the celebrity he was, didn't really want the public to know he was getting married. And so consequently, here I come from the States. I land, I'm going through customs. The guy looks at my passport and he says, "Okay, Mr. Watson, so why are you coming here to Jamaica?" I said, "I'm going to marry Ian Boyne." And Ian Boyne's getting married? The custom officer says that to me. And I went, "Oh." You know, I let the cat out of the bag. Before you knew it, the news was all over Jamaica that Ian Boyne was getting married. And so as a result, the news got out, but it was going to get out anyway. So Ian laughed when he saw me. He laughed, and it was always comical because he had such a boisterous laugh. Oh! You know, he was like almost like Santa Claus when he would really get wound up in some cases. But at any rate, at that reception, after we went through the wedding and all that, I was sitting at a table, and I got to seat with the Seventh-day Adventist minister, because I wasn't licensed in Jamaica to sign the marriage license. I performed the ceremony, but I wasn't able to sign the license to make it legal. So the Seventh-day Adventist minister, who Ian had a relationship with, was there to sign the marriage license. So I'm sitting at the table, we're having dinner and so forth, and I said, "So, how many congregations do you have in Jamaica?" He says, "How many do you think I got?" Or we have, Seventh-day Adventists. And I said, "I don't know, dozen?" No. He was an older gent, very humble guy. He says, "No, a little higher." I said, 2 dozen, 3 dozen? No, a little higher. I said, 50, 100? No, a little higher. So what congregations we're talking about? He ended up telling me that they had over 600 Seventh-day Adventist congregations on the island of Jamaica. Now, granted, some of these congregations are families, a half a dozen folks, 5 folks here in a house, and so forth and so on. But get this, the big congregation in Kingston of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I understand, based on that conversation I had with that gentleman that evening, going back now probably about 10 years or so, was over 1,000 people in that congregation of Kingston for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in looking at some of the history, if you do take some time to do that, you'll find has been plowing that ground for years, as well as the Church of God Seventh Day. So the island of Jamaica is real fertile ground for Sabbath keepers, Sabbatarians. I mean, it is immensely fertile ground. As a matter of fact, I stand here today to let you know that the Prime Minister of Jamaica is a Seventh-day Adventist. So George Romacon has no problem in getting the Sabbath off, because George Romacon today came out of retirement, out of politics, because some years ago the Conservative Party was able to get back into Jamaica, and the Prime Minister that the Prime Minister that got into that position had a very good, strong friendship with George Romacon, and he wanted George to become the Jamaican consulate in Canada, because he knew George real well. And so George, back around 2011 or so, went ahead and operated as a diplomat in Canada, which helped us an awful lot in Canada in building the congregations, especially in the province of Ontario. And as a result, he spent 6 years in Canada for us through about 2017, of which today the Conservative Party is back in power. By the way, the Liberal Party got back in between there, because George had a 3-year stint with the Conservative Party, and then the Liberals got back in, and they kept George in Canada for another 3 years because they liked George too. So they kept him for 6 years in Canada, but now the Conservative Party is back into Jamaica, and they moved George. So today George is the ambassador of Jamaica in the UK, as well as some of the European countries surrounding that whole area there in Western Europe. So he's also working as a co-pastor with Pedro Hall in the Jamaican area. So we're very, very encouraged with what is going on in Jamaica. Lots of things that have happened. Another bonus story real quickly here regarding that funeral. It was essentially attended by about 5,000 people physically sitting in the arena. They had rented an arena, and it was televised, as I understand. I don't know exactly some of the numbers. Maybe Dixon might know some of the numbers that were televised around the world and throughout, but it was well over certainly a couple of million folks that viewed that particular funeral. When the procession, we went down to the cemetery from that arena, as we were driving down with the hearse and so forth, and the police escort and military, basically, there were people lining the streets as though a dignitary had died. It was an amazing, amazing sight to behold. As a matter of fact, we stopped because of all the people on the street. They were blocking the street, and the police had to get them pushed away. And some of the people were walking up to the hearse because we were in the first car due to the fact that George Ramachan and I conducted that funeral, along with some others, of course. But we could hear people because we were right, the hearse was behind us, and we were looking in the rearview mirror, and they were crowding the hearse saying, "Is that Ian Boyne in there? Is that Ian Boyne?" They're looking in there and knocking on the windows as though he's going to say something, But at any rate, it was quite as I say, a sight to behold, and certainly something that I'll never forget because of the event that it was. It was really an amazing, amazing event. But I want to take the remainder of my time here to illustrate to you just what and why that is, because Jamaica really is an outgrowth of the Church of God International's commitment and dedication to evangelism. We are very dedicated and very committed to evangelism because we feel that there still is a major purpose to inform, teach, and challenge under the auspice of witness and warning, and of course the fallout of that, to teach and nurture, to inform and educate people to draw close to Jesus Christ and get to know God the Father through, as we understand, the truth of God that has been revealed to us in both of these testaments. So as a result, we have been very, very busy over the years doing the best that we can to try to use as much and as many of the assets that come our way in this modern day and age of the 21st century to maximize the values of each and every one of these particular assets. The results, and Jeff and I, because a lot of this is due to Jeff Reed and his partner there, Wesley Worthen, as well as other people there in our home office, which, by the way, is only about a half a dozen people or so that are really behind what we're doing in terms of our distribution of all of the things that go on. And what we've been generating, along with my wife, working in the back of the scenes, doing the editing on some of the products that we are posting, both video as well as in writing, we have here 100,000. Now, these are weekly statistics that I'm going to give you. We have 100,000 potential views on Facebook every week. 100,000. You do the factor of 52. You do the factor of 52 on 100,000. 50,000 followers now we've accumulated on Facebook. We have 50,000 followers following the Church of God International's administration and work as we continue to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. 1,300 weekly views of our Sabbath service out of the home office, roughly averaging about 700 views out of Medina, Ohio, where I come from, and that's my home congregation. These are weekly now. These are weekly numbers. 1,300 for the home office, 700 weekly views of Sabbath services, factored that by 52 weeks a year. Jeff conducts a program called Bring on the Sabbath. We use the acronym BOTS every Friday night, not every, about maybe, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, 2, maybe 3 times a month. You can find out when that happened on our website at CGI.org. But it is a program that lasts about an hour, sometimes a little over, maybe an hour and a half at the most. And it's a combination of folks interactive on the internet, as well as a bit of Bible presentation, advertisements, announcements, and things of this sort. And it's kind of a nice light program that allows people to warm up to the Sabbath and have some fellowship over the internet. And it's attracting upwards now on an average of 4,000 views. And when I say this now, keep in mind, these are connections, views. That means it could be 4 people around a table watching bots. Could be, 3 people around a table watching the Sabbath service being webcasted. We don't know how many connections we've got today, but again, using an average, I'll be conservative, average of 2 connections. We were talking about the Sabbath Sentinel, and mentioning 600, but nevertheless, you're looking at, I think you said times 4. I'll be conservative. I'll say just times 2. We've got in the Tyler watching the Sabbath service, 2,600 additional people plus the ones in our audience. 2, just using a factor of 2. Or Medina, 1,400, factor of 2. So you do the arithmetic. It's an amazing numbers as you begin to multiply these out. The Armor of God television program, our flagship television program, a half-hour program of the talking head, consequently B-rolls coming in with footage and pictures and PowerPoints and music, is roughly averaging now about 10,000 views a week on YouTube. 10,000 views average on Armor of God programs, but 5,000 views on YouTube on an average for non-advertised programs. In other words, when we do a program, we post it on YouTube. It's out there. It's drawing, attraction. Some of our programs, if you kind of do a search on YouTube, go to YouTube, put in CGI.org, and you'll see all of us pop up. You can go down the list and see how many views each program has accumulated over the years. And we've got some programs now that have accumulated 5-figure views on this. And we're averaging, and Jeff has been able to calculate this, 15 minutes per view on YouTube of our video products. And that's quite encouraging, considering the fact, get this, that the average time watched on YouTube is only 4.4 minutes. And we're averaging about 15 minutes per view on our products. So that's telling us something, that we're getting people's attention. And we're keeping their attention in such a way that, at least they're giving us quarter of an hour time to consider what we're saying. And my wife, who does many of the YouTube shorties, we call them just little vignettes. They're designed to just, kind of attract youth. It's more high energy. They last only 9 to 12 minutes. That's one product we have. And many of the speakers on the Armor of God do those along with some other guys. And we'll hit a topic and just drill it home and then try to drive them to the website to get something of more substance and a little bit deeper. That roughly is not even 15 minutes. So hopefully some of those are being watched in totality. But this is really phenomenal growth that we've seen over about the last half a dozen years or so. The CGI, I've often said, has been the best kept secret among the churches of God because, quite frankly, we really didn't have a delivery system. We had a lot of products, but they were all on the shelf. They were all on the shelf. We had no marketing, if you know what I mean, if I can use a secular term. And with the advent of Jeff and many of the people there, Wes, and my wife included, along with others in the home office, we are now beginning to get these products off the shelf and into the hands of the public where they do in fact belong, because these are the information items that we've got to share and to use as evangelistic benefits for people to come into contact with the Church of God, as well as hopefully build a relationship with Jesus Christ, which is so important and really, frankly, is our objective in trying to do what we're doing. So it's not about the money as far as that's concerned. However, I can't ignore this statistic because it helps us to use our money more effectively, and that is when we were on TV, because the Armor of God program was indeed on television for quite a few years, up until probably just about a half a dozen or so years when we shifted to the internet. Since we've shifted to the internet, we were on television, and when we were on television, it cost us on an average about $20 to process a response. As a matter of fact, there were times that were even higher, 25, even as high as $30 per response on television, because television was so expensive. And consequently, today we've got it down to an average of $3.50. How about that? $3.50. Amazing, So here you have a cost of 15% at most, at the lowest point of television, $20, but 10% of the cost now at the highest cost of television at $30, $3.50 on the average. So that is really encouraging, and it allows us to use our revenue for other things, needless to say, and gives us an opportunity to be far more cost effective. Now, something else that we're really excited about, and this just has happened over, I would say, Jeff, 2 months maybe, last 2 months, 8 weeks, I can't see that, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, is it's the app. The app. 2 months. And as a result of it, we started out with a couple of hundred or so that downloaded this app, the Church of God International's app, to our iPhones or iPads. You can do that. And today we're up, after 2 months, to as many as 2,300 already. And this app is so convenient. If you don't have it, go ahead and download it on your iPhone or iPad. It has all of our products cataloged and categorized, collated in such an easy way you can navigate it. You could be at an airport, you want to hear something, pop it up on your phone while you're waiting for your airplane, or you're at the dentist office or something. Real easy to maneuver and navigate through, to choose and select whatever you might want to select, even sermons and so forth, for your ease in listening. And we're really happy about it. It's hopefully going to be a real asset and enhancement to the advancement of our products, again, of which are all geared and, of course, designed to introduce people to what we believe to be the very truth of God. In addition to that, and let me back up for a minute. And this app is a very important element, especially in light of our freedom of speech being infringed on. And that's what you could say a hidden benefit of this, because, when you get shadow banned because you're saying Hillary Clinton, I mean, we used to get called down on television when we said, well, Adam and Eve, because Adam didn't marry Steve, we'd get called down on that. Or we'd say women were created to mate with men. We'd get called out on that on television. Canada wouldn't even play some of our programs because we said women were created to mate with men. I called up the program director after we got contacted back then, and I said, I forget her name now, I'll just say Susie. Susie, I said, well, let me ask you, what do you want the women to be mating with? And she said, oh, Bill, don't say that. I mean, it was amazing. So moving to the internet, we thought, well, we're going to get a little bit distanced with this censorship stuff, you know, and hopefully we'll have a bit of more freedom of speech. Well, don't kid yourself. The voices of God's truth and what we're talking about, what we're confronting today, the issues at hand by which we challenge people and inform people about is drawing attention. Some years back, even my life got threatened for saying certain things about certain things. Brethren, we can't hold back in this day and age. We have a country, it was said before, going to hell in a handbasket, with people being confused now about what gender they are, when in fact there's only two genders. I often tell people, you get confused, just take your clothes off and go in a mirror and look. Make a determination. It's quite clear as to what gender you are in most cases. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure these things out. But these are things we take so much for granted, not realizing how secular and humanistic this world is getting and confused as a result. I remember back when we were talking about, what was it, George Bush was wanting to create some kind of a statement to define what marriage is. How can you be confused about something so fundamental as marriage? Well, you can when you begin to allow moral relativism to incrementally encroach on your reasoning. Or postmodernism, when you question everything, even things that are obvious. You just question it because it's a postmodern time. You've got the license to. If I feel this way, I got the right to feel this way. Come on. Use your head. But this is the world we're living in, as well as party politics. We're still talking about party politics when in fact we ought to be talking about globalism versus nationalism. What is stopping the growth of globalism, which happens to be what I read in Revelation 17 and Revelation 13 and in Daniel 7 and those portions of your Bible of which talk about a world government that's going to mark its constituents so it can control the people. Come on. Forget Democrats, forget Republicans, forget independents, forget these party politics, and let's get with the fact that we're looking at a globalist agenda being worked in front of our eyes. And you know what? As long as there's nationalism on the board, there's a certain element all of us can be a little bit, for the time, relieved. Now, I know nationalism could go south easily because I know all the stories about Hitler and Mussolini and all the rest of them like you do. But the fact of it is, for the time being, nationalism is an obstruction to globalism's movement and progress. And that's a good thing in many respects. That's a good thing. But I digress. The point that I wanted to make is that the Church of God International is doing its best to evangelize, and we've got a very evangelistic spirit in our attempts to try to share this gospel. We're on Roku. That's another portion of our work, trying to get away from this censorship. We have our own network on Roku. We have our own network on Apple TV. We've got different products that afford us different opportunities to present segments of the gospel in different fashions. We've got, for instance, the armor of God, which gives us a forum to address anything from marriage to child rearing to prophecy to anything. Christian living, we can take a half-hour program and really dissect it and take it down many layers of the onion, as they say. Other ones we have called web chat, where 2 guys or 3 guys sit in an environment where it's like a library with books behind us as opposed to a desk and a map. We sit, it's casual, it's more laid back, and they get into conversation, kind of like what we're going to have later on with the round table. And we go ahead and we talk about, where are the dead? What does the Bible teach about immortality? And we just talk, conversation. And it's oftentimes, I've had feedback, even Victor Kubik from United, he's watching the web chats and has told me personally that he prefers the web chats over the armor of God because you digress into little vignettes of discussion and so on that oftentimes cover a broader scope of the product because of the conversation that you're getting into. And then, of course, we have biblical news updates and commentaries where it's more or less, if you remember the Spokesman's Club, the attack speeches, you know, where you can really get exercised over a social issue or some kind of moral violation that the world is considering on doing, and take it from the standpoint of comparing what God's Word says to where the social system is taking us. And these are all exciting things and opportunities for us to, in different fashions and ways, express the gospel, and needless to say, attracts different types of people. Some people might like the biblical news update and commentary means, or the, what you could say, armor of God, or even the bring on the Sabbath, where they can just fellowship and lay back in easy conversation, and hey, hi Judy, how are you? I'm doing fine. Good to see you on the internet tonight, you know, and all that, and talk about light things, or hear some Bible study about Christian living and so on. It all works together in hopefully broadening our attraction to increase the value of that connection with Christ and hopefully to the Father. So I just wanted to mention that. We do have one product that I just wanted, as I close out here, to share with you, and that is our international news. This is our, what you could say, flagship publication. Comes in a newspaper format as opposed to a magazine. That's why I was asking questions about magazines, because we had that on the table and off the table many times over the years. But we still maintain a quarterly newspaper, church newspaper, called the International News, and it's filled with a whole lot of things, from articles on doctrine and Christian living to what's going on in the church, reports on the feasts, you know, that we had at the end of the year and so on. Each quarterly edition covers certain areas based on the season, of course, that we have in the news items that we might have. We have obituaries in there as well, and different events that are going on in different areas that the ministry shares with the whole church at large, called the International News. And we've got about 3,000 or so subscribers to that, and every once in a while we'll advertise that as an offer on our Armor of God program. That's about it. I think I got through it. We're on time. So do I have questions? Questions, answers to for anybody that wanted to mention anything or make a statement about something? Yes, Doctor.
Group, it's actually nearly 90% comes from word of mouth, somebody talking about and empowering it. And I'm asking you, what are you guys doing in that? But I'm going to throw out something else that I'm a proponent of, I've never got anybody to do, is reestablishing the Spokesman's Club. Because I remember back in Worldwide, that prepared so many leaders, so many laymen who maybe didn't go in the ministry, but in my case, in medicine, I learned to communicate, I learned to engage, and I learned these basic speaking skills. My sons learned those kind of things, and it put us way ahead in even professional lives. Have you all considered something like a Spokesman's Club, some other method to empower the layman to do part of the reaching out, rather than relying on ministers with sermons and TV and so forth?
Absolutely, and I understand what you're saying. Answer to the first question with regards to how are we empowering the membership that meets with and connects with this administration of the Church of God International. We are advocates of always encouraging the brethren to go to our website if need be, or if they feel, I mean, they have abilities to type on their computers as easily as we do in writing articles and what have you. But with people and time and management and so on, we always encourage people that if indeed you're talking to a relative, let's just say you're talking to them about the origin of Easter, and you got into a little bit of a scrap with your Uncle Henry over where's the origin of Easter. It's a Christian. Oh, no, it's not, Uncle Henry. Well, yeah, what do you mean it's not? All my life, and you get into this argument. Well, we encourage the members, go to the website, cut and paste, and put it out there, to your people on Facebook. Be empowered. Go out and generate conversation. And it's interesting, more and more people are indeed doing this, and or sending that message to Uncle Henry to let him read some of that and lead him into maybe an encyclopedia article to show that that the belief is not necessarily just our belief, it's history. You can't change history, talking about this Easter thing. So one thing about us in attempting to empower the membership that connects up with this administration is using the social mediums. Use your Twitter account, use your Facebook account, get into the public square, mix it up, challenge, inform, teach people. And brethren, do indeed find, I guess, more courage behind the keyboard sometimes, and really do go out there and really talk about things that they wouldn't necessarily talk in person, because there's this detachment of sort. You know, I've met people where I said, "You're that guy on the internet saying that?" I meet him, he's as mild as a lamb, but on the internet, man, he's a tiger, you know. It's amazing how they take on these different personas. But to the advantage of preaching the gospel, oftentimes these social mediums for the brethren can be very, very good venues by which they can use as tools to advance the information that, like I said, if it comes from a minister, an article, whatever, they can cut, paste, they can give a little snippet of a sermon, whatever that might prove their point, and say it better than what they think they can say it as, when oftentimes they might be able to say it just as good. But that's one thing. The other thing is, with regards to educational programs within the Church of God International, yes, we do. We have formats and actual official programs. We have a leadership training program implemented in our congregation, in the Toronto congregation, where we do teach certain things about speaking and so on, and apologetics. In Jamaica, they have also a comparative religion class that they deal with regards to teaching the brethren on how to explain certain doctrines, how to talk to people, interactive techniques on how to develop those techniques. In CGI's case, out of the Home Office officially, we have the MIP program, which is the Ministerial Integration Program, whereby we have a program by which we, in getting to know ministers who are experienced, who come to us wanting their credentials recognized from other organizations and Sabbath-keeping groups. We have this program, formal program, put together, curriculum and all, called an integration program. We call it MIP. We also have a MAP program, Ministerial Apprentice Program, where we look out among us in our congregations and we will sponsor perhaps a veteran minister that has got to recommend somebody along those lines, his perception, and he goes ahead and looks out amongst him, as we're told in Titus, you know, look out among you and ordain elders in all the cities, he told Titus. And so we do that, and we put them in the MAP program. It is a correspondence course, about 2 years, 2 to 2.5 years it takes to go through, very intense, and it gives the minister, the sponsoring minister, the veteran minister, the journeyman, so to speak, opportunity, professional forum to correct, to guide, to enhance, to teach, in a classroom between the two of them fashion. And then every once in a while, like we just recently had 2 weeks ago, we had a MAP meeting where we brought all our candidates into Cincinnati, Ohio, and Charles Gross, Wynn Skelton, and myself ended up teaching for 2.5 days like we're doing here with a more intense class on these MAP apprentices. That program, though, is not a leadership program. That program is designed to end in an ordination. So along the way, if the mentor says, "You know what, Kelly, I thought you had it," but 6 months in, you have that heart-to-heart. You have that heart-to-heart. And so you cut that tether, so to speak. And hopefully he doesn't get mad. Hopefully they understand, and it's a mutual agreement, that, you know what, I'm not really comfortable in this, and I thought I was, but, I appreciate the compliment. You're thinking I was, but I'm really not, that kind of a thing. But that's that professional forum that it affords you, hopefully, in developing that relationship with your candidate as a mentor. So we do have a program. I didn't touch it. I had it in my notes, but because I saw Kelly giving me the cane, so I'm trying to stay on time.
I wanted to add to something that you were saying. I don't know if I've got the mic.
Okay, thank you. I do want to add to something he was saying with regards to John Merritt's question, and you had asked, what is Church of God International doing to empower the individual to go out and evangelize, essentially? And what they're using is they're using their app and their digital network. Okay, do you know how Jehovah's Witnesses evangelize? Okay, one of the things they do is they whip out, because I have a lot of insurance clients who are Jehovah's Witness. They all think I am Jehovah's Witness, even though I tell them I am a witness for Jehovah, but I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. Anyways, but what they do is they'll pull out their phone and and they'll say, "Hey, watch this video." And what the Church of God International is doing is they are empowering the individual through these different media outlets to say, "All right, you have a friend who's interested, like he said, in the origin of Easter and what that means. We'll just show it to a friend. You could do it in person. You can send a link." But also, the Church of God International has levels of videos. In other words, they've got some things that are, more simple, verse by verse commentaries, for instance. Adrian Davis has been doing that. But then they also have more in-depth teachings available. So they have levels, which allows them to do both evangelism to people that are new, but also discipleship within their own group. So,
yeah, and to Kelly's point, there's a 12-hour lecture series to the identities of America and Great Britain, focused on the migrations, but it's a 12-hour lecture series on the CGI website. Yeah, Jeff?
I just wanted to add, if I get the microphone, I just wanted to add, as far as the question about what are, the empowering the congregations to evangelize, the reason why in our marketing we're seeing the type of results is because people are evangelizing. It's not, it's what we're doing, but like on, say, for instance, on Facebook, we'll post a video and 100 people will share it. And so if 100 people shares like a video or an article, and again, we have people who write articles who are in our congregations, they write articles, they send it in, they share, and it gets spread, this kind of viral thing. And this year, and I couldn't understand, I was trying to like wrap my head around why are we getting so many responses this year? Because we're not spending that much money. But all of a sudden, people are ordering the stuff and things are coming in, and a lot of it has to do with just people just sharing it with their friends. The app is so easy. Just like, hey, you just put it on your phone. And now you have like this unlimited library of information that's going to continually update each week. So it's the people out there are really helping with that, and I see it. I guess and again across all churches.
Is the app connected to YouTube, or is it independent of YouTube?
See, it's completely independent. So the app, like you said, we can't be censored on the app because it's our own platform. And the company that we do it with is a Christian company that has the same values that we have. So they're not going to kick us off for anything that Bill says.
And to accentuate what Jeff is saying, I want to go back and reiterate something he said in passing so you don't miss it. That all our members are welcomed to write articles, put them in the international news. There's a 3,000 person, that's our subscribers, 3,000 right out of the box. You write an article, put it in there, and we, encourage our members. We're looking for writers, we're looking for writers and people from the Church of God culture to write articles about certain things. We put that in the international news, and they can do that. They can blog, like Jeff is talking about, and we'll post it on the website from time to time. So we're always looking and encouraging our brethren to express and be themselves and help us and enhance the witness.
So they're spreading more by word of click rather than word of mouth. The old way was the word of mouth. Now it's the word of click. So,
Any other ones? Questions? Yeah.
row 10 here.
If it's okay to offer a comment, maybe. I appreciate all the things you guys are doing. I teach in a prison, and I was supposed to be there last night, and I told the guys I couldn't be there, but that's not really a problem to them, because when I came to the prison back in 2013, my very first message to those guys is that I'm going to teach you how to teach. And so I learned that from a guy named Ian Houghton. Ian Houghton gave a sermon back here about 2008 or 9, or no, I'm sorry, 1999 or 98, something like that. And he said, he went through the scripture where Paul says, at this time which you ought to be teachers, you still have need of the milk. And what we found, and what I found myself, is that teaching, you prepare for a 10-minute talk, you'll spend an hour and a half doing it, and you're going to learn a lot more than you're going to be able to teach.
Amen. Right.
And so we've taught those guys how to teach, and now they are evangelizing within the prison themselves, because now they know that they can dig this stuff out, teach it themselves. And so they teach. Last night I had one of the guys teaching. And in fact, what we did is we took and put everybody on a rotation basis. They had to teach. I didn't even give them an option. You have to teach a 5 minutes little thing every, on your rotational thing. So this is the type of program I'm looking forward to seeing people be able to do, is just realize that people can teach if they can teach even if they don't think they can teach. I'm not a good speaker. I know I'm not. But I can teach. And what we want people to realize is that the teaching is not as important as the fact that you're going to learn so much from the teaching, you yourself, by preparing for that.
Yeah. Oftentimes the teacher learns more, to your point. Absolutely. Yeah, I find this so fascinating of the manifestation of the different gifts, because what we're talking about are these different methods by which God teaches the broad population of planet Earth, and you can't put God in a box. You can't put him in a box, and we're all gifted in certain ways. You know, I'm not gifted for prison ministry. I'll just tell you outright. I'm not gifted for it. There's just no way. Yet there are people that are gifted to just sit down and talk one-on-one. I'm okay with that to a certain extent, but I don't personally enjoy that. You know, and
Get on TV and just hammer it down
and-
like Ian Boyne, right?
yeah, like Ian, exactly. So those are, you know, I believe the manifestation of the different gifts, and praise God that there are those that can fill in those gaps, because guess what? We need each other to continue to propagate this gospel in a comprehensive way. So that's good. It's to God's credit.
Question for the break.
Tim, we need to talk. And talking about prison ministries, I live in Henderson, Texas, and we have 2 prisons in our town, a state jail and a treatment center. And we have a Toastmasters club. I've been Toastmasters for like 20 years and speaking clubs for 40, 45. And that is another way of doing a prison ministry where the focus is not necessarily on the gospel and preaching, but it is working with people that are typically getting that counseling with the chaplaincy program, the people that are coming in, talking to them one-on-one. And these people are coming into these Toastmaster clubs. It's the #1 requested program in the prisons is Toastmasters, because they learn to develop, they get confidence, and all the things we learned. That we went to Ambassador College with the Ambassador Clubs and Spokesman's Club. Self-esteem, confidence, all of that. And some of these, like one guy was mentioning giving his icebreaker. He said, he was talking to me before he got up there. He said, I'm more nervous about giving this speech than I was robbing banks.
That's true, though.
And that's true. You know, I'm an ex-banker, so like I couldn't imagine myself robbing a bank.
Yeah.
But it's changing people's lives. So when you couple together the ministries, whether it's one-on-one with the people coming into the prisons, and I'm like you, I don't think that's me, but I love the Toastmasters, the program we learned in college, and leveraging that is really changing the lives of these people, and the recidivism rate drops down a lot if they do 2 or 3 of these programs. So anyway, I'm looking for some help because I'm in 1 club already, and they want 2 or 3 more in Rush County. So if anybody wants to partner with me on that, I'd be willing to help. Invite you to come beside me and help these people changing lives. Thank you. My name is Don Everly Smith, by the way, in case you don't know who I am.
Yeah, personality development is very, very important, especially for prisoners, because once they gain some self-confidence in that, they find that they're capable of doing different things, and oftentimes that they lack so much self-esteem, and they're insecure, and what have you. A lot of stuff goes on there. Oh, to your point, just real quick, short, it was a comic strip. I'll never forget this. When I was fresh, I'm wet behind the ears, right into the church. I was 21, 22 years old, joined Spokesman's Club, and the pastor, Mr. Allenby, gave me this little comic strip, and he said, "You're going to be nervous." And the comic strip was, this guy was out there with safaris killing elephants. He was shooting tigers. He was in the hunt with leopards, shooting them and all that on these big safaris, big game hunting things. And then he was to go to Toastmasters and explain what he was doing, and it showed him up there in the lectern shaking. And he's out there shooting all these big animals. That always stuck in my mind to illustrate what you were saying of how nervous, you're not nervous robbing a bank, you're in your element and all that, but once you're out of your element, man, I'll tell you what, it's something else.
Thank you so much, Bill. And if we get some more time somewhere, we may have him come back up here and answer some more questions, because it seems like we might have had some more. Well, let's just thank Bill Watson right now for coming up here and presenting. That was tremendous.
Thank you.
I never did. It's incredible because there's been a lot of Sabbatarians serving government, and there have been a lot of Sabbatarians serving governments in different places of the world, and so I did not know that about Jamaica. I mean, I just got a whole education right there. I can write an encyclopedia article. I've been educated. That was very interesting. So we're going to start the next session at 10:15. What time is it now? I didn't even look. 10:08, 10:09, 10:10. We got 3 different times. So 10:15, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with Royce Mitchell, and he's all the way from Houston, Texas. He's the editor of the Sabbath Sentinel magazine. He's going to give you a history of the Sabbath Sentinel magazine. So we'll be back at 10:15. Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, everybody, we're going to have the next session with Royce Mitchell. Should I say Dr. Royce Mitchell? We're glad to have him. He's here from Houston, Texas. He is the editor of the Sabbath Sentinel magazine. That is the magazine of the Bible Sabbath Association. In fact, I believe this is your second time being the editor in the history of the magazine. So he has been with the BSA, I would say probably now over 2 decades or about that much? Over 2 decades. So he is going to have some great insight about the Sabbath Sentinel and the history of the Sabbath Sentinel. The Sabbath Sentinel magazine was started right about 1950 and in that time period. And so we're going to welcome now Dr. Royce Mitchell to come on up here and tell us about the history of the Sabbath Sentinel magazine. Come on up. And this guy's dressed sharp.
My wife dresses me. I'd say happy Sabbath, but it's not the Sabbath, is it? Thanks, Kelly. As Kelly said, I'm here to talk somewhat about the Sabbath Sentinel, which is the premier magazine for the Bible Sabbath Association, the BSA. The BSA has a 70-year history of bringing God's people together, despite congregational or organizational or doctrinal differences. Those things often divide us, and we try to approach our interactions with people with how things are that unite us. What are the things that we believe in common? What are the things that we can agree on? Because those things are much more important than the things that divide us. It's just not that important to us what individuals' understanding and beliefs are. What's important is, do they look to Jesus Christ as the Savior, and do they intend to walk in the commandments, the way of God? And if so, then we consider them brethren, despite what the other beliefs might be. Well, what strategies has the BSA employed? Obviously, the Sabbath Sentinel is one of them. It's our most recognizable tool. We have other things. Obviously, we have the directory of Sabbath-keeping organizations or congregations. We don't have any of those here, I don't think, but we do have that book. We're looking to transition that into a web-based online publication. Beginning in 1950, that's when we started it. It celebrated, it published its 500th issue in the spring of 2003. And in January of this coming year, we will publish our 600th edition. So this has been an ongoing work of love for many people for a long time. As Kelly said, this is my second stint. I didn't get enough the first time, obviously. I was pleased to be relieved by Ken Ryland, and unfortunately his health went south a couple of years ago, and I was honored to be asked to come back and edit again. And so I'm pleased to do that, and I guess I'll stay with it until they get tired of me or they find someone else who can do it better. So I'm just finishing up 4 years this time. So I'll be covering a little bit about the history. I was going to say some complimentary issues would be available over there, but it appears like everyone took them already. We've got a couple of booklets over there, I think, that you can grab and take with you if you'd like. But the magazine is free and it's online. So if you want to go back and look at past editions, you can certainly do that. The past editions now go all the way back into, I guess, the 1960s, Brian. Isn't that right? About in the 60s right now are actually online. We've had that work in progress now for, I guess, over a year, trying to get all of them digitized and get them on the internet. And there are a lot of interesting articles that were written 30 and 40 years ago about the Church of God. Some of the early editions were mostly texts from Seventh-day Adventists and Church of God Seventh-day groups, although the initial founders were Seventh-day Baptists, as I recall. So the articles were written by those, but as time has gone by, certain people from the Worldwide Church of God movement, the splinters off from that, have come in and written articles for the Sabbath Sentinel. I'm one of them, as a matter of fact. That's how I actually began my association with the BSA was writing articles for the TSS. And it wasn't too long after that, then I got tapped to join the board and become the editor. Not that that's important. What's important is that the magazine has been ongoing for many, many years. And it's there as a service, not just to you, but to anyone you might want to give the magazine to. It's not focused on denominations. We don't, when you look at the magazine, you will actually see writings from people who are Messianic Jews. You'll see writings from that. You'll see people who have been part of the worldwide movement. You'll see people who are Seventh-day Adventists write for it. You'll see Seventh-day Church of God Seventh-day writers on it. So you get if you get the magazine and read it, you get a healthy dose of what other people think that are in other groups. And it's not proselytizing. You're not going to get a letter from us saying we need to go join this group, because that's just not how the BSA is. Our idea is to bring everyone together, not to find ways to send you apart. We'll help you find a congregation locally to you. Yes, we'll help you do that. But we're not going to try to get you to go to one place or another. We started off being a black and white 5.5 by 8 booklet years ago, over 50 years ago. And it stayed that way for a long time. Eventually, I believe it was in the 1980s, early 1980s, they started adding a little bit of color in it. Single color books were coming out, but they were highlighted. They weren't necessarily pictures or anything like that. It was a very simple magazine full of text. Somewhere between 1980 and 1988, I haven't been able to nail that down yet, the book actually went to a commercially printable form. And some of you may remember Tom Justice, his organization, his group over in Arkansas, actually printed the magazine at that point. And that was about the place where I came into the picture. It went from about 20 pages to 24 pages, and you begin to see more pictures in it. Not a lot, but some. Some advertising was going on in the back of it. But it was primarily still a text-based magazine with a picture on the front. And it remained that way until essentially 4 years ago. And now we try to incorporate pictures of congregations, pictures of works. This last cover that is over there is actually a picture of the aftermath of Hiroshima. And we put that on there because an article inside talks about some great miracles that happened after the bombing in Hiroshima in Japan at World War II. It's an interesting article. It was put up by Bill Lusenheid. It's well worth the read if you want to get the book and read it. Presently, magazine has become a tool that highlights articles from different Sabbatarian authors. But it also more aggressively promotes the booklets and the other offerings that the BSA has. Something we've been sort of neglectful in promoting. Much like CGI was talking about it. We had the books on the shelf, but nobody knew we had them. So we're getting more aggressive in letting people know we have those books. We want people to get those and use them to promote their own congregations. We don't want them to necessarily to drag somebody into a group or another. These books are all generic types that people can get to understand the Sabbath day, what to do, how to keep it, when is it, who should keep it, where should it be kept, should it be kept at home, should you be fellowshipping. Those types of books are available in our libraries, and they can be purchased at fairly low cost. But we still promote the understanding of the various groups by printing those articles that allow us to understand who they are and what they think. Some well-known articles who have written, authors who've written for TSS. Samuel Bakioki, he's written for TSS. Ken Westby, you probably recognize that name. Calvin Burrell, Richard Wiedenhoff, Richard Nichols. Tom Justice, who I mentioned was our actual publisher at one time. He's written. Daniel Botkin, Brian Knowles, you may remember that name. John Classic, may remember that name. Tara Luttrell, Dr. Doug Ward. All have written at one time or another articles for the Sabbath Sentinel.
So you see, we don't just reach out and grab one group and say, you write for us. We look out amongst us and find out, well, who would like to write for us? Who would like to tell us about your type of your organization, the things that you believe? Who would like to help explain that to your brethren? And because after all, if we keep the commandments of God and have testimony of Jesus Christ, we are brethren. We just have to love one another. And by focusing on how we differ, we don't show our love. But when we focus on how we are alike, it opens the door to loving one another. Because the things that bring us together are just so much more important than those things that separate us. There's a lot more authors that have written than I've got time to mention today. But they've all done one thing in common, and that is they support the idea of the BSA, the idea of unity in Christ. Not unity in organization, unity in fellowship, unity in love. That's been the organization's goal from the very beginning. As you can see, participating in the effort that we are undertaking to find ways of commonality rather than ways of difference is a wonderful thing. And it has caused us on the board to see different groups in a different light. We have on the board Church of God Seventh-day, independent groups, Messianic Judaism, and yet we can all sit and talk. We had a meeting a few years ago. We sat and talked, did the business, and got along fine. What that shows you is that if we can do it in our group, we can all do it. We don't have to stand off in a corner and say, they don't think the same way as us. And this is what the Sabbath Sentinel is about. That's what we're doing. Remember that Jesus Christ, at times, he ate in the homes of sinners. Well, that's what the self-righteous Pharisees said, right? Not that they weren't sinners. But they said he ate with sinners. And Jesus responded saying that the sick were the ones that needed the physician. They didn't think they were sick, did they? So he went to the sinners. We have to do the same thing. And the reason I bring that up is because the Sabbath Sentinel and the BSA has to do what other groups are doing. We have to come into the 21st century with our efforts to outreach. You see, the children of today are not watching television programs for religious content. Everything that they read and watch comes on a little device in their hand. They're called the mobile generation. And I was pleased to see CGI have an app for that. We all need to be doing that if we're going to have outreach to the children. And that's really what I think is the most important thing to do. We have to bring a younger generation to the church. If we don't do that, then the church won't die out. Jesus Christ said that. But we're going to be an aging church with very few young people coming. And we don't want that. We want something better for the church. We want to see the kind of growth that God wants to give us. And we want to do that through the incoming of the young people. Now, in the Sabbath Sentinel, we've asked the questions, is it relevant to keep putting out a printed magazine? We've discussed that on the board even, because it is expensive to do. Those of you who do a magazine, you know that. But to answer that question, this morning I got a request for a hard copy subscription from a gentleman. I'm not sure where he's at. I saw the address, but I needed to pass it on, so I kind of neglected to take note of it. We also got a request for assistance from a congregation in Africa this morning. So our efforts to reach out are actually having good effect. And we can thank Kelly's leadership for that. But we need to continue to work towards the idea that if we're going to bring in young people, it's not going to be because they order a magazine. And it's probably not going to be because they watch the television show. It's going to be because they got pointed to an app where they pushed a button and up pops a screen with someone that's got text, or he's got a short message about, why don't these pastors teach about the Sabbath day, to get their attention. that's what's going to work. So will the TSS go on? I'm thinking probably so. But it won't go on as a magazine that prints thousands and thousands and thousands, because the idea that people were going to be wanting in that form is probably going by the wayside. With that, I think that concludes the history of the book. If you guys would like, I'll go ahead and take questions now. Sure.
What percentage of articles do you reject? 5%, 10%, and then what percentage of articles that are submitted do you reject, and what are some of the reasons that you reject articles?
That's a good question. I only reject articles that are antagonistic towards other groups. It's my idea, and the BSA's idea, to promote understanding. In order to do that, you have to let a Messianic Jew say what's on his mind, what they believe, what they think, how they worship. You've got to throw that out there, and the reasons why. So if I reject that group because I don't like the fact that they wear tzitzis, I'm a hypocrite. Not that I don't like. I'm just using that as an example. It doesn't matter to me. So, but what I'm saying is, I have rejected at least one article that I can think of because it was very antagonistic towards other people, other groups. And I'm not going to let that be in the magazine because that does not fit our mission. If you want to be antagonistic to other people, okay, but you're not going to do it in the magazine. The magazine that we put out is for the purpose of reaching out to the Church of God in Big Sandy, to the Houston Church of God, to the churches in San Antonio, to the churches in New York City, everywhere, and they can all pick it up and say, oh, I didn't know that about those guys. I didn't know they thought that. I wonder why they think that. And then you can read the article and find out why they think that. And maybe you find out you believe some of the same things. Such as yesterday when we were listening to the gentleman who is a, I want to say sacred namer, but he's not a sacred namer. He's a Hebrew roots. That's what I was thinking about, Hebrew roots. I found out that in the congregation that we do have some things in common with that group. We're very strongly pushing towards sola scriptura. We don't want other people coming in and saying, well, you have to follow me or believe this to be a part of what God's doing. In fact, I think it's a lie. I think God has every one of us at our own stage of understanding. And if God has us at a certain stage of understanding and training, who am I to say anything about that that's negative? We take the position, and the BSA has a position, that you could be right, you could be right. Well, guess what? You could both be wrong. We've been wrong in the past, haven't we? Sure we have. So if we can be wrong in the past, we can be wrong now. We need to have that attitude towards our brethren, and this is what we're promoting. Remember, you're in a development stage. You're still learning. So let other people learn too. Don't beat them up. Let them have their way, and as God opens the mind, you'll change, they'll change, or you'll both change. It's not important the differences. What's important is testimony of Christ, keep the commandments of God, love one another. That's it. And if those articles meet that criteria, I will publish it. I have a backlog of articles to publish now. But if that article in any state will say, well, that group over there does this, and that's completely wrong, and they're not part of what God's doing, that's not going to make it in the magazine. So I hope that answers your question. That's the only time that I will cut an article.
So very few are actually rejected.
Very few are rejected, and generally speaking, I don't outright reject it. I will send it back to them and say, hey, look, you said this in here, and it's very antagonistic. Can you reword that to be less antagonistic or not antagonistic?
I might add to that there's a difference between. Sorry, I'm an improv kind of person. I didn't know if it was on. I might add that there's a difference between disagreeing with an idea or a concept, a belief, or a doctrine, and attacking a person. So, for instance, we've had articles maybe disagreeing with certain views on prophecy, but they were disagreeing with the view and not saying, well, I tell you what, that group over there, they're just a bunch of heretics because they're, well, why don't you just disagree with the viewpoint, because you're actually more likely to appeal to someone with that belief if you will just refute the belief or disagree with the belief. And so that's where we do draw a fine line with the Sabbath Sentinel. That's what I've noticed over the years. So.
Right. For instance, a couple of years ago, Calvin Burrell and I had a couple of articles we wrote comparing keeping the holy days versus whether or not you should. I mean, whether you should or you shouldn't. And he took one side and I took another. But in the end, everyone could see that, hey, you know what? They're still acting like they love one another. And that was the point. We can have that difference without being antagonistic or hateful or ugly. And this is the whole premise for the BSA, the whole premise. Bringing us together. Not one congregation, not one organization, one love, one church pointed towards Jesus Christ, not pointed toward a man. Next question.
Yes, I think you sort of brought it out just a second ago. Do you oftentimes or ever look for themes that you want to publish? Like, for instance, a debate between festivals or not festivals and stuff like that, where you're soliciting articles along that line?
I seldom have a theme magazine. And the reason for that is it's 24 pages. About 20 of it are devoted to articles. And if I start off with this theme and go 20 pages, I'm not so sure everybody stays with all 20 pages. But if I get a theme, not a theme, but if I get an article on keeping the Sabbath, I get an article on Hiroshima, like this last time, the miracles that happened and the aftermath of that great explosion. And I get an article on church leadership. What's that like? What's it about? It provides that differences of reading that gives someone a reason to keep reading through the magazine, because they're going to get a little something different rather than a porridge of the same thing over and over. Now, that has been in the past. Sometimes that has been done. I have not done it, and I don't really care to do it unless someone says, hey, I'd like a magazine that goes through scenarios where you might not want to, or where you might have problems keeping the Sabbath. And maybe get some input from that, maybe get some articles on that. I might do that, but it's going to be focused along the lines of keeping the Sabbath and a problem that people in the church have. As we all know, many of us have that problem out there in the world of not being able to get off of the work on Sabbath, or being threatened to lose their job for not working the Sabbath. So I might do that, but primarily, no, I don't have a theme on a magazine. I'll take the articles and I'll kind of mix it up a little bit and read through them, make sure that they're not antagonistic. And as I said, I don't get many that are like that, because I think everybody understands what we're trying to accomplish, and that's love for one another, not antagonism.
Well, and I will add to that we can only put in the Sentinel. He can only choose from the pool of articles that he receives. And so it sometimes can be very difficult to try to do a thing, because you've got different writers contributing different articles, and they're not collaborating with each other because they're either parts of different groups and they're contributing different. You might have somebody send a prophecy article, and then a Hiroshima, which is a more modern day history, and then somebody, like I usually write ancient history, and then somebody does a practical, and they're on different subjects because they're all from different groups. And so when there have been some thematic, but not a whole lot, but it's mainly just because you had the pool that came in at that time was on that subject. So if that helps out a little bit.
Yes, and I will add this. If you are a writer or want to write, we'll be glad to take a look at it and publish it, because we want people to understand the different segments of the Church of God. We don't want a Church of God over here that nobody understands and everybody says stands off from them because they don't understand them. We want an article from them saying, okay, well, here's what we do, and here's why we do it. then we can understand what's going on. So if you have any writers amongst you here, we'd be glad to take articles. My email is in the magazine, but if you don't want to go look it up, it's royce.mitchell@rocketmail.com, and those articles come right directly to me there. Who had a question?
I do.
Yes.
In your publication, since you are promoting so much of focusing all of us on what we have in common, have there been any articles, or have you encouraged the leaderships of the various Sabbath groups within, a community that's fairly close to come together, maybe at holy days, or come together maybe once a month on Sabbath, where the leaders of those fellowships get together and work out a program that would be agreeable to all, maybe 3 or 4 leaders in that area, to where all the membership would come together as a community. It would be awesome for the kids and awesome for fellowship. Have there been anything like that you've found?
Not as far as the TSS. We have had some outreach in our local congregation, trying to accomplish that. Recently, we met with another Church of God group in Houston for a short talk about abortion, which I'll have an article in July's magazine based upon some of the things that I found out there. We're not here to interfere in congregations. That's not what we're about. What we're here is to say, Congregation A, did you know Congregation B believes this? Through the magazine. And Congregation B, did you know Congregation A is really thinking the same thing you are? No, you guys talk about it. I'm not saying join together because you have your own leaders, but I'm saying, don't back off from loving one another or fellowshipping one another simply because you meet over here and that guy meets over there, and maybe one group has one slight difference from the other, or maybe one group doesn't like one guy or the other. I can't even imagine that anymore, but we've had enough of that, I think. But we don't need to be separated and broke apart simply because we believe something a little differently. We don't want that. And that's all we're trying to do, is to encourage that fellowship. That's primarily what we're doing on one hand, and our second goal is obviously to preach Jesus Christ and the commandments of God, the keeping of the Sabbath. That's the 2 functions that we reach out in the magazine. We're looking for writers who will approach it from those 2 directions, and we do have writers who are doing that. And we always can use fresh blood in writers, and as I think Bill could probably testify with his magazine. You always need the fresh writers to come up with different concepts and different ideas.
I did want to, for just a moment, clarify. I think one of the things she's saying is ways that maybe we could promote cooperation. And one of the ways ideas I've always thrown out there is the idea of a 5th Sabbath meeting, because I've known of groups that did that. So what they do is they talk to the different Sabbath groups within so many miles, or most of them choose 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the size. And they come to an agreement that every 5th Sabbath they're going to have a joint meeting, and they'll have 2 speakers, and they rotate speakers so that over the course of a year, every group has had one of their people speak. I know that my home church did that very successfully for a number of years. It sort of fell off after some time, but I know that's one thing. But that might be a good article for you or someone to write, is ways we can cooperate and sort of thinking outside the box, maybe doing a community service project together, or keeping the holy days together,
Sure.
And so I think those are all great ideas, and I think this meeting sort of promotes the whole concept behind that question. So I did want to.
Sure.
With regards to writing, I have 2 questions, but the first one regarding writing, do you have any guidelines, for instance, do you want to receive it in Word, PDF filed? How many words do you want as far as the article, 500, 1,000, 1,500, that kind of thing? And I got a second follow-up question to that, but
Sure.
Any guidelines?
The magazine is only roughly 20 pages of text, so we don't want a 15,000 word diatribe.
But you can also do a multi-part series.
Yes, that was where I was going with that.
Okay.
We can take an article that deals with a lot of things, like, for instance, we did an article by a guy by the name of Michael, and his last name skips me right now, that was broken into 8 parts over 2 years. We did that, and it just ended last summer, as a matter of fact. So we will take it and break it apart if there's some logical way to do that. If we get an article that's kind of long, a lot of times I'll write back and say, this is a really good thing. I'd like to publish it. Do you have a logical way to break it apart for us? And we work with authors that way.
So you don't really have a list for like a guideline? We use a
Yes,
guideline.
I do.
Oh, you do?
I hadn't quite
Okay.
gotten there yet.
Okay.
I would prefer to receive it in Word format. I can use them in PDF format if I can pull the text out of it. And that means that they have to be created as a PDF in the program, the word processing program where it was typed in. Taking it, scanning it in, printing it out, and scanning it in doesn't work because that's an image file. So I really have to have the text because I don't have the time to retype an article, particularly a long article, one that I think that it is really worthwhile for brethren to read. I don't have time to retype 8 pages of text. Yeah, I just don't have that kind of time. Remember, I'm not paid to do this. I have to work like you guys do. So I need the most cooperation I can get to get these things published. And so I asked for a doc or a text file, TXT file, something along those lines to make it easier for me to grab it, put it in the magazine, and then I can sort it out and then format it, and then I can sit down and read it, and say, whoa, wait a minute, I shouldn't put that in there. Rip it back in and send it back to you and say, hey, you can't call those guys over there spawn of Satan. You've got to put something in there that's nice. If you don't agree with it, just say what you don't agree with. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps.
Doc files and text files.
Last question, and then you mentioned you have ads, like 4 pages or so are devoted to ads. So is it acceptable to perhaps advertise our feast locations, a little 3x5, 2x4, 2x2 ad in your
Yes.
publication?
Anything that's church related, brethren related, whether it's a feast or it's a gathering of brethren from congregations in an area, our book, yeah, exactly right. Anything like that that's a positive, uplifting thing, yeah, it's fine to advertise it. We used to have all the advertising in the back and it took a page. And I found that was not getting the message out about all the wonderful stuff that we have at BSA that people can order for very low amount of money that would help them promote their own congregations in the Sabbath day. So I've started putting ads throughout the magazine to break up the text, give it a little better visual appeal, and to just get the word out about the stuff that we do have to offer, the really good articles and really good pamphlets and really good books and booklets. Yes?
What's your lead time on getting things into you before it's in the magazine? Thank you.
The July magazine will come out in middle of June, and I'm down to waiting on Kelly's article. So I'm almost done with it. So I would say if you want an article in, let's say, September, I really should have it in July. That gives me time to read it and go through it and say, yeah, that's a pretty good deal. Let's leave it in there or I'll make changes. I don't do much editing per se. I'm not going to go in and try to change the wording around to make it more palatable. If it's ugly, I'm just going to send it back. But what I will do is if I see something that's not spelled right, I'll fix that. Or if I see a thought that's not a full sentence, I'll try to flesh it out. I do an editor's job. What I'm not going to do is a ghostwriter's job. I want you to say what it is you have to say, and then we'll pass that on because we want the brethren to hear what you have to say.
You had that article this week, by the way. Well, to answer, to tack on to what Bill was saying, so we have had people advertise their book, a book they've written, a booklet, or, even if, I guess if they wanted to advertise that newspaper they do, that would be a great thing if you wanted to try and get some subscribers from us to also subscribe to y'all. I will say this, we did one Feast of Tabernacles ad in 2006 in the Sabbath Sentinel and started a whole church off of that because we had people visit from another city came to our feast site, and then we started a whole congregation that still exists today. It's been around for 11 years. So, there's lots of benefits there.
What do you charge for ads?
I don't have that information in front of me.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not a lot. I think it may be, what, $100 a quarter page or something like that?
Something of that nature. If you'll email him, if you'll send him an email, he will get back to you when he is able to look at that.
Okay. Not only that, if you'll grab one of those magazines over there, it's right inside the back cover.
I added some more magazines over there.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yay, Kelly.
Thanks.
Lead time for ads is, if you want it in September, then I need to have that no later than August 1st. I can put those in pretty much last minute, as long as you have the ad. If I have to create the ad, I need to know about it ahead of time.
Hi there. One of my questions was, when we have been in church splits and stuff, and then you're wandering around going, where am I going to attend church now? And I've been grateful because I found, I think you guys online at one time, and I've lived in parts of Texas that have no church, basically. So anyway, my question though is calendars, because often I'll find out about church events after the fact. And and I'm like, oh, I'm going to remember that for next year. Well, you don't, like East Texas has this barn dance, and whatever in November or December. That's a great deal of fun. And I missed it 2 times because it wasn't on a place, I wasn't receiving it. Is that something that you can do? Have people submit things to a particular calendar for in the month of June or July? Here's what's happening in these churches.
That's actually a very good suggestion. We used to do that in the past. We had a monthly calendar or bi-monthly calendar that would come out, and it would have some things on it that people would send in. And I'd be willing to do that again. It's a little tricky to into a 8.5 by 11 book to get it in there, because you have to put it in sideways, and it's a little tricky to do that. But I can do that, and I'm willing to do that if I get enough people that will send that information in. So yes. One of the things that I want to mention, though, I think it's this edition just came out, we did a story about Church of God Outreach Ministries and what their mission is, and they just had a big meeting here in Tulsa here a few months ago, and I attended and got some information from that. So if we have different ministries that are getting together, we'd be glad for one of us to go there and take notes and write an article to kind of let people know what's going on with CGOM or CGI or other groups like that. So yeah. But the calendar is a good idea. I'll think about how we can implement that. May have to advertise it a few months first.
Because I found out about this because we went to CGI last weekend, and Jeff was telling us about this, and I'm going, what is BSA? Sure. Now I know.
There you go.
Well, I think years ago we used to do kind of like a classifieds. They had a page of classifieds, and churches would put different events. So maybe that kind of format, either a calendar or a classified section for events. That's a great suggestion. No, that's a great suggestion.
No dating.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else? Right. Well, okay. I appreciate your taking the time to stop and listen to us today. And by all means, it's a free magazine. Order it. If you want to look at it online, you can do that. We don't know how much longer it's going to go, but right now it looks like it's going to continue on, because we just have people continuing every month to write us and say, hey, I want your magazine. And either they don't have internet access or they don't want to read it online. So we're going to keep going in that direction. But we still need writers, and we still need people to help us to let other people know about the magazine. Did you have a question?
We have time, right? Yeah. Got till 11:15.
I'm going to go back to the prison ministry idea. I had this idea a few months ago that, like in Henderson, Bradshaw, we have a chapel that First Baptist Church in my hometown built, where I actually went to church as a kid. And they have services there on Sunday. And the idea, why don't we have Sabbath services and rotate in churches? Seventh-day Adventist is interested. The CGI expressed some interest as well. And so I did approach the chaplain about it, and I think he was a little puzzled, like, why would anybody want to do a thing like that? He's an Italian guy, so he may be Roman Catholic, I don't know. But I didn't get the feeling that they're welcoming that, because they kind of have their own agenda as well. But what I found out was that they tend to be more responsive as opposed to proactive, meaning that if the inmates ask for representation or ask for services from a particular church, then they will look to provide it. But if nobody's asking, then they're not going to go out there and give us an opportunity to say proselyte, right, or evangelize, right? It's more, there's a need, and we fulfilled that need. So maybe because in Henderson there is that chapel, there's a perfect place to have services, that maybe collectively as an organization we could try a pilot and see if we can get the chaplain to go along with the idea, schedule some time, and then have like once, matter of fact, what the churches do in Henderson is every week, they rotate which church is leading the service. So it may be Methodist one time, next week it's Church of Christ, next time it's Baptist Church. Why couldn't we do a similar thing that, and then once a month, it's CGI week, or it's Seventh-day Adventist week, or rotating in other churches from the BSA network. Just want to throw that out there and see if there's any way to make this thing work, and any partners that like to partner with me on that, in addition to the Toastmasters ministry. But I do have an in there, an MTC that runs that prison. They also operate some, I think, down in the Diboll area. And there's a whole network across the country that perhaps we could create more traction and create little churches, in a sense, inside prisons.
Sure. If I may?
Yes.
That is a perfect scenario for an article for the magazine.
Really?
And the magazine does go into a number of different prisons. And we would like to get something like that into the prisons, where they give them the idea that, hey, you know what, if we don't have something going, perhaps we can go to the administration of the prison and get something like that set up.
Yeah.
Where we can reach out to local Sabbath-keeping pastors and have them come in on a rotating basis. So that's an excellent thing that we would like to see in an article in the magazine, because we do get into the prisons that way, and they would see that and read and go, oh, hey, that's a good idea. So that would be a way you could help us do that.
Okay. Is it possible that,
yeah.
Pardon me? Is it possible that we could find out which prisons have magazines going in? Because that could be that seed to go to the chaplain saying, we know your people are getting literature, and now we could offer an actual live service or some kind of a meeting once a month or something like that.
Sure,
that might be a...
Right. I don't know personally which ones they're going into. I know a lot of prisons are getting them. We could find that out and perhaps get back with you and let you know where those are. But I know there are a lot of, we are getting, in fact, we get regular requests from people in different prisons. Hey, I saw your magazine, can I get a copy of it?
Right.
So we send it to them, no charge.
Okay, that could be a good place to start. Well, thank you.
Sure.
We'll follow up on that.
You bet, thanks.
I guess Barbara would be the one to ask about that.
Yeah, Barbara would be the one. She would know where they're going.
Brother Tim's got a question.
Brother Tim.
There again, I guess it's a little bit more than of a comment, but what he said is a really great idea, because when you think about going into a prison, you may have 10 guys in that prison. If I had 10 guys in my fellowship who are as active and dedicated as those guys are, we would have 100 people in our fellowship. Sure. And so that is a good area to start. And these guys, when they do come out, they stay in touch, and they're looking for a place to go.
Good. Okay. Any other questions? thanks for listening to me, and I'll give it back to Kelly.
All right. Thank you so much. That was great. I really
Thanks.
enjoyed that.
All right.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mitchell. That was excellent, and excellent presentation on what the Sabbath Sentinel is all about, and excellent questions from the audience. I mean, that was, one of the things that makes a conference like this successful is the interaction and the input from the audience, and you guys have been tremendous. Great questions. We do have a little bit of time right now, so 11:30 is the next speaking slot, so you guys can hang around. I had promised Bill some extra questions. I didn't know if he wanted to take some more question and answers at this time, since we have a little bit of downtime between the next. Do you want to take some more questions and answers, Bill? Are you good? Do you want to take some more questions and answers? Say that again. Oh no! Did you want to take some more questions? Yeah, if we can have you take just maybe another quick. See if is there anybody else that has any more questions for Bill? Because I know we had to kind of stop, and I promised if we had some downtime, I'd give him some more time. But if anyone has any questions for the Church of God International presentation that we heard with Jamaica and some of the details of their outreach. We'd be glad to take some more questions if there are any, and if not, that's okay. But I wanted to make sure we gave plenty of time.
On Bill's publications in regard to the United States and the British Commonwealth and prophecy type thing, he's done an excellent job on putting that all together. Was it 5 or 6 CDs?
Yeah,
about 7 CDs on it, and they are really go into detail. And it brings out a lot of the who we are and where we came from. And you tie that in with some booklets. I don't know how many are familiar with Stephen Collins' books. He's got 4 books that covers ancient Israel. Well, he actually got 5, but 4 of them are together. Brings it from the old days to up till now. But if you want to know the real history of Israel, Bill has put on several different things, but those CDs and some other ones, shorter ones too.
All right, well, thank you for sharing that. Yes, he's done was it a 6 or 7 part series on the U.S. and British in prophecy?
It's 12 hours, I think, on 7 discs.
12 hours on 7 discs. So that's an extensive teaching for anyone that's interested in that subject, wants to learn more about it.
It's in the app right now.
And it's on the app. Come on now.
I don't want to forget, I know, how many of you know Ron Dart Ministries, Born to Win? I've worked off and on with them and with my cousin Linda Benton, and they have a new app also, the Born to Win. If you haven't seen it, you can download it. You know all of Ron's material that he's got, just scads of Bible studies about, Romans and the epistles of Paul, and I would look at them and stare at them and go, I want to take that with me on the next trip. Now you can download it and take it with you on a trip. Linda and I tested it going to Kansas City, and for a women's retreat up there that we really need to write an article about, right? Anyway, so the kind of the fun thing is we found out you have to download a couple of them in order to hear them, because you end up losing the radio waves, Yes. And we did it on Bluetooth too, so you can hear it better on the speakers. And it's also the children's programs. So if you have small kids in your congregation, you have a lot of material out there for free.
That's a great
Isn't that
point.
awesome?
CEM
Yes,
Born to
CEM
Win.
Born to Win.
They have an app now, and it is excellent. In fact,
BornToWin.net.
I think it's in a similar format to CGI. If I
Yes,
remember
they work
correctly.
together on that. Yes. Oh.
Yeah, we actually were using the same company.
Okay.
And again, if anybody's interested in an app, I can give you information of what it costs and takes technically to put together an app. But I guess talking about the Born to Win app, because I guess they were selling these CD sets for, how much was it for? The $24 or $50, $19 of all of Ron's work, because it's expensive to produce that. And like when I got the app, I opened it up, I'm going, man, there's a lot of value because all the stuff they used to sell is all right there in that app.
Yeah.
It's good values.
And you can download things too.
Yeah, and all the YEA lessons that where they had posted is $4.95 each. I mean, if you called and said we don't have any money, they'd send it to you for free. But still, yay!
It's a great tool, teaching tool, and we know CEM is definitely what they do is in line with what the BSA is all about. So, thank you for sharing that. That was a good point. All right, sounds like all hearts are clear. We're gonna see you guys at 11:30. We're gonna do a teaching on the Waldenses. We're gonna finish yesterday's. stopwatch so I can stay on time. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and start the next session. So if you want to get where you're happily situated. All right, everyone, we're going to start the next session. That's session 3 for the day. It is Waldensian Origins, Part 2. Waldensian Origins, Part 2. My name is Kelly McDonald, Jr. I'm president of the Bible Sabbath Association. I always have to have the junior on my name because my dad's Kelly McDonald, so, you know, I don't... One time somebody came up to my dad and was like, man, I heard you're a preacher. And he's like, oh, no, that's my son. You know, so I always put the junior on there. Most of the time I do. And we're going to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. So yesterday we had talked about the Bogomils and we had talked about the Paulicians. And I think I've got a map here on slide 2 that we're going to start with. On this map, you can see the Paulicians dwelt in eastern Turkey, what we call Armenia in ancient times. And many of the Paulicians migrated to an area in the country of Greece, or near the country of Greece, called Thrace. And so I think I've got sort of a little bit of a summation on the next PowerPoint slide about that. So the first migrations of Paulicians to the Balkans or the Eastern European area was in 752 AD under the reign of Constantine V. However, by the 900s AD, somewhere in the middle to the late 900s AD, there was another 200,000 of the Paulicians that were migrated to this area. And again, the reason why they were migrated to this area is because they were known to be good fighters. These people, the Paulicians, were known for also being semi-autonomous communities. In other words, the Paulicians could kind of take care of themselves. The empire didn't have to provide for them, say, things like welfare or even protection for that matter. The Paulicians would protect their own. The Paulicians would provide for their own. They were a semi-autonomous community that the emperors of this time, at least in the 700s especially, actually trusted them. I'll tell you a funny story. So the emperors actually trusted the Paulicians so much so that they didn't even send troops sometimes to the frontiers. Well, here was the problem with that. When the Paulicians liked the emperor, they would fight for the emperor. When they didn't like the emperor, they would just move out of the way and let the invaders come on through and take over. So it sort of was a double-edged sword for the emperors of this time. But now we're going to pick up with some history in the 800s AD as we continue our journey towards studying the history of the Paulicians and leading up to the history, of course, to the Waldenses. So in 866 and 867 AD, the Bulgarians come under the authority of the Pope for a time, or for a season. Now, you have to understand that the Bulgarians, most of the time, the Bulgarians came under the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which, of course, we know Constantinople was in the modern-day country of Turkey. I believe we call it Istanbul today. But there was a time in Bulgarian history, about this time, the Bulgarians come under the authority of the Pope. And these Bulgarians were mostly pagan, and they were writing a series of questions to the Pope, asking the Pope, how do we live a holy life? How do we live a Christian life? And so, based upon these questions, and I think there were about 100 or more questions that the Bulgarians wrote to the Pope responded to every one of these. And so, we're going to talk about a couple of the responses that the Pope had. In fact, one of the first responses the Pope had when he wrote to the Bulgarians is that he acknowledged that Armenian and Greek Christians had been sent to Bulgaria. And these were Armenians and Greeks who were not a part of the Catholic Church. So I want you to consider that for just a moment. The Pope is acknowledging that there were Armenians already in the Balkan area at this time who were evangelizing the Bulgarians. And it's interesting he calls them Christians because that was the name that the Paulicians called themselves. They called themselves Christians. It was always their enemies that called them Paulicians. But there's also another response. It's called Response 99 that we're going to look at, and I actually have a quote from this. So, one of the questions that the Bulgarians had asked the Pope was whether or not we should we be forbidden from working on Saturday or Sunday. Now, why would the Bulgarians ask this question? Well, first of all, there were Sabbatarians in the area. Also, you have to keep in mind that the Eastern Roman Church at this time still considered Sabbath to be a holy day. Oh, did you know that? Interesting. We'll look at this. Here's what the Pope said. You wish to know if anyone is permitted to perform any labor on Saturday or Sunday. Concerning this matter, the oft-remembered Holy Pope Gregory said, while addressing the Romans, "It has come to my attention that certain men of a perverse spirit have sowed some depraved things among you which are contrary to the holy faith, so that they forbid anything to be done on Saturday. What else should I call such people except preachers of the Antichrist?" And so, in the Pope's response to the Bulgarians asking him if they should not work on Sabbath or Saturday, he quotes Pope Gregory I, who lived about 600 AD. And Pope Gregory I said that if you forbid people from working on Sabbath, you are the preacher of Antichrist. Well, that's kind of, wait a minute. Christ obeyed the Sabbath, but if we teach people to live like Christ, we're Antichrist. That doesn't make any sense. That's flawed logic. But that was the kind of logic that the Catholic Church engaged in often in these polemics. But again, this is just another proof that there were Sabbatarians in the Bulgarian era at this time. Then we go to 867 AD, about the same time. There was a schism between the Eastern and Western churches. Now, we know that in the 11th century, the Eastern and Western churches permanently split and became the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, or the Latin Church, as some people call it. But the first schism happened in 867. Do you want to know the two reasons why the Eastern Church wanted to split from the Western Church? Watch this. The first reason was that the Latins, or the Catholic Church, believed in fasting on the Sabbath. And the Eastern Church still considered Sabbath a holy day at this time. To give you another writer of the time period who you can use to confirm this, Anastasios of Cyanada wrote in the 700s AD. And he talks about how the Greeks and the Eastern Church still honored Saturday Sabbath as a festival day or a festive day, even into the 700s AD. He lived in the 700s, but this is confirming that they continued to honor it as a special festive day into the 800s AD. And what's interesting about Anastasius of Cyanada, this same writer, his work called Questions and Answers was one of the first works of literature translated in the Slavonic language, one of the first Christian works of literature translated in the Slavonic language, which was the language that was spoken in Bulgaria and the areas around it. So it's interesting that we have multiple layers of evidence pointing toward the fact that the Eastern churches already honored Sabbath still even at this late date. But the second reason that they split from the Catholic Church was forbidding priests to marry. Now, there's an early Bulgarian legend that's very fascinating, and Nina Garsoian, in her book, The Paulician Heresy, talks a little bit about this, but it describes the history of the Bogomils, and these were Bulgarians who didn't like the Bogomils, okay? But they said the Bogomils were started by two devils. One was called Sabaton, and the other was called Sutil. Well, you know, Sabaton means son of the Sabbath. So some of the Bulgarians did not like the Sabbath, apparently, and they sought to sort of demonize it, literally. But this, again, is just a fascinating anecdotal story from their history. So we have some evidence leading up to the information we're going to get into that shows us there were Sabbatarians in Bulgaria and the Eastern, what we call the Eastern Roman Empire at this time. Now we move to 950 AD. A man named Bogomil. Now, Bogomil in the Bulgarian language, it means beloved of God. Bogomil, it was the name of the founder, is considered the founder of the Bogomil sect. He begins to preach a different message that the Greeks have not heard before. Now, Theophylact, who was the patriarch of Constantinople, wrote between 940 and 950, and he described the Bogomils as Manichaeism mixed with Paulicianism. Now, what is Manichaeism? To be very simple in my explanation, Manichaeism is sort of a syncretistic religion that took elements of Christianity and elements of Gnosticism and some of the elements that Bill talked about yesterday, that takes these elements and tried to form a sort of a one world religion of sorts, even though obviously it didn't make it all the way around the world. But one of the features that made people think the Bogomils were Manichae is the Manichaeans were what we call dualists. Okay, now what is dualism? Dualism is the belief that there was a good God that created spiritual things and an evil God that created material things. So that's what dualism is. And the Manichaeans were known to be dualists. But I want you to notice that even the Patriarch of Constantinople makes a difference between Bogomils and Paulicians, right? He makes a very fine distinction between the two. The Bogomils have taken this Manichaeism and mixed it with Paulicianism. This is very fascinating. So thus, Paulicianism was a separate movement and belief system from Bogomilism, but still interrelated. Thus, Paulicianism was a separate movement and belief system but from Bogomilism, but still interrelated. Interrelated in that they were sometimes lumped together, even though they're obvious. And I'll tell you this is fascinating, just a side note here. According to Runtsman and also Obolinski, who wrote on this subject, there were autonomous communities of Bogomils and Paulicians in the 1900s AD. And so these groups were considered separate people then. They were considered separate people in modern times. So there's obviously some marked differences between the two groups. Now, let's now talk about the differences between Paulicians and the Bogomils, because I think this was a question that came up yesterday. This was already in the presentation. So let's talk about the Paulicians, and we don't have time to explore every single belief, but we'll give you sort of an overview. The Paulicians rejected images and crosses. They rejected, we call that iconoclasm. We talked about that yesterday, iconoclasts. They rejected prayers to the dead, which you know that the Orthodox and Catholic believe you can pray to the saints and they can intercede on your behalf, even though the Bible says there's only one mediator between God and man, and that is Jesus Christ. But still, those traditional churches practiced that, but the Paulicians didn't. The Paulicians rejected the festivals of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. They rejected infant baptism. They rejected transubstantiation. However, they also believed in fighting with the sword. They were not afraid to defend themselves and sometimes to be aggressive towards other people groups. But they also tried to keep separate. That's one very important characteristic, is they tried to keep separate from Catholic and Orthodox religious practices. They really tried hard to stay away from them. They condemned the abuses of the Catholic Church and the traditions of the Catholic Church. They were considered very evangelistic. Okay, that's in a nutshell what the Paulicians believed. So we're going to now transition to talk about Bogomilism. Now, Bogomilism is going to have some similarities, as we just discussed, but Bogomilism is going to have some differences, and we're going to explore those as well. So here's the similarities. The similarities is, just like the Paulicians, they rejected images and crosses. They rejected the prayers to the dead, the festivals of the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. They rejected infant baptism. They rejected transubstantiation. However, where they begin to diverge is they were very pacifist. In other words, the Bogomils would willingly, instead of fight, they would just lay down their lives. So they were very much a pacifist group in their early history. Now, if you study the later history of the Bogomils, they'll pick up a sword and fight anybody. But that was when they were on the verge of extinction. And so that was, I guess, maybe they looked at that maybe a little bit differently. But in their early history, they were very much pacifist. Now, another difference, which is very fascinating, is that the Bogomils would mingle with Catholic and Orthodox in public, but then spread their doctrines in private. And so this is pretty interesting. So this is a difference between Paulicians and Bogomils, okay? So the Paulicians wouldn't go to the Easter service or the Christmas service, but the Bogomils would. They would go to the Easter and they would go to Mass, and they would kiss the cross and bow to the Virgin Mary and do all that stuff. Outward, they did all those outward things. However, in private, they practiced their own doctrines. And so in public, they practiced the Orthodox festivals, but in private, they rejected them. That's kind of, I know, a sort of a compartmentalized version of religion, but that's the way they did it. They were also dualist. In other words, they believed that Satan created the material world. And this contributed to some of their mingling with the Orthodox and Catholic Church. Here's the reason why. Because they viewed the material world was evil, they didn't think it mattered what you did outwardly. So it didn't matter if they kissed the cross or bowed to the Virgin Mary or took a transubstantiation communion with the Catholic Church and prayed to the dead in public or whatever the case was. They didn't think any of that mattered if you outwardly did it but inwardly didn't really mean it. In other words, you were just going through the motions. And that's because they were dualists. So they believed the material world was evil. And due to this, they rejected marriage. Okay? And they rejected the eating of meat, which are two heresies that Paul lists in 1 Timothy chapter 4, right? He said that there would be seducing spirits that would teach people not to marry and also not to eat meat. We first see this heresy in the 2nd century AD, but we can see here that this group also rejected it as well. But their enemies, like the Catholic writers and Orthodox writers, they spoke about the purity of the Bogomils because the Bogomils were ascetic. In other words, they did not engage in any of the joys of life. And so the Catholic and Orthodox always have viewed that as like the ideal way to live. In other words, don't have any material possessions and don't really do much for yourself, sort of the vow of poverty mentality. And the Bogomils were very much in the same way in agreement and sometimes with the Catholic Church on that subject. So that's a little bit of their beliefs, and I do want to talk about the later Bogomils for just a minute, because again, this message is not to give the full history of Paulicianism and Bogomilism. That would take more messages to do that, but the later Bogomils from the 1200s onward began to merge with Messilanism. The later Bogomils began to merge with the belief system called Messilanism. Now, what are Messilaeans? I do have to explain this for just a moment. The Messilaeans were a group started in the 400s AD that was dualist, but they had a very strange belief system, and I'll try to summarize it the best I can. But basically, the Messilaeans believed every human was born with a devil inside of them. That's kind of crazy, Everybody's born with it, so, everybody starts out on a bad foot automatically. But they believed that if you would fast and pray for 3 years, that devil would leave you. So if you would fast and pray off and on for 3 years and you'd stay dedicated in fasting and prayer, the devil would leave you. But then here's where they get really crazy. If you thought that was crazy, here's the craziest part. They believed that once the devil had left you, you were then as God and can do whatever you wanted to. Some crazy beliefs. So it led them to some bad sexual immorality was one of the sins they fell into. But the later Bogomils, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, they merged with Messilanism. One of the, I know it sounds crazy that such a group that was considered pure would merge with Messilanism. Well, to be brief, but I don't want to get too deep into the theology of why they probably did that, but I will give you just sort of a sample of why scholars think that they did merge. Number one, the Bogomils would conform to whatever group was around them, right? So if they're around the Orthodox and they're around the Catholics, they're going to do whatever the Catholics and Orthodox do, right? Well, if they're around the Messilaeans, what are they going to do? They're going to just meld in with the group they're around. They're sort of like a chameleon. Wherever they're at, they sort of just, hey, when the Muslims come over and take over, they start doing Muslims and they start praying with the Muslims, okay? But here's the thing. How is it that the Bogomils could reject marriage but then be engaged in sexual immorality? It almost doesn't make sense, but here's the reason. You have to understand the Gnostic mindset. The Gnostic viewed the material world as evil. And they viewed making babies as perpetuating material beings that are evil. Therefore, they were against making babies. But because they thought the material world was evil, they didn't see anything wrong with sexual immorality at some point. I know, it's such a convoluted... It's like you're reading the letter to Thyatira when you're reading this stuff. It's like, hey, you got this woman, Jezebel, you're tolerating her, committing sexual immorality. I mean, that's what was going on at this time period. But now we're going to transition to Western Europe because this is where we start to connect with the Waldenses. What's interesting when you study Western European history, starting with Charlemagne, we see some sort of rumblings, we might call them tremors, of the Paulicians in Western Europe, or people that believe like the Paulicians at the very least. So let me give you some examples, and we don't have time to cover every example, but from 817 to 827, there was a man named Claudius. He was the bishop of Turin. He destroyed crosses. He destroyed pictures. He forbade pilgrimages. He forbade people to pray to the saints. And what's interesting is Turin is located in the Piedmont Valley on the France-Italy border. And this is where we would find the Waldenses in later times. But we find this guy who's considered sort of a forerunner of the Waldenses. But watch this. He is teaching a very similar belief system to what the Paulicians are teaching. Now, I want you to keep in mind a detail from yesterday's message. 817 to 827. Why is that an important time period? Because this is the same time that the iconoclast controversy is going on in the Eastern Roman Empire. And here we have someone in the West, in the valleys of Piedmont, in southern France, northern Italy, teaching iconoclasm. In the heart of Catholicism, no less. So you can imagine what happened to him. He got burned at the stake. At the same time, though, it's interesting that there are some sources that state Charlemagne died just before this time, but there are some sources that state that Charlemagne had Armenians in his court. So it is very possible that some of the Armenians that came into the court of Charlemagne in France, what we call modern-day France, were indeed iconoclasts themselves and may have helped this Claudius, bishop of Turin, who at one time of his life had taught in the court of Charlemagne. He very well may have been influenced by them. There was another man, Agobard of Lyon. I think he's on the next slide. Argobad of Lyon. He expressed similar views to Claudius. And of course, Lyon, or Lyons, is in France. Again, we're seeing something is going on here, and there's not a lot of people teaching these things, but we see the beginnings of it. So we're going to skip just a little bit forward in time. And we're going to look at 1049 AD. There was the Council of Rheims, and they excommunicated a group that they called New Heretics. I believe that the Latin would probably be something like Novum Hereticos. But here's the thing, they call these people, we don't know much about what they were doing, but they were heretics in France. And they're not given any name, but they're just called heretics. Then we have 1056, the Council of Toulouse, which again is in France. And Canon 13 of the Council of Toulouse excommunicates those who participate with heretics. So whoever these heretics are, they are really getting traction to the point that the Catholic Church says, we've got to stop this. But they still don't name them yet. I find that pretty fascinating. Maybe they didn't know what their name was. Who knows? As we go down the timeline here, we're going to see 1096 to 1099 is the First Crusade, roughly that time period. Bohemond of Otranto, he attacked a city in Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is near Thrace. And he actually burned some people and attacked a city because they would not bow to the image of the cross. Now, of course, this was a Paulician belief and also a Bogomil belief that you don't venerate the cross, probably for different reasons. The Bogomils wouldn't have venerated the cross in private because they just simply believed that material things were evil. And how can you worship a spiritual being with such a thing like a cross? Now, the Paulicians would have been iconoclasts simply because the second commandment, that would have been their appeal, to not honor a cross. But he called the group that he found the Publicani, and many scholars agree that the Publicani is simply a perversion of the name Paulician. 111, 19 AD, the Council of Toulouse. Where is this at? France. Same place we saw a previous council. Canon 3, the heretics are condemned. Why? Because they deny the Lord's body and his blood as sacraments. They deny the baptism of children. They deny holy orders. Now, what is holy orders? In the Catholic Church, holy orders is a reference to the ordination system. Okay, the Catholic Church holy orders are deacon, priest, bishop. Okay, so they rejected the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and they rejected the ordinations of the Catholic Church. These are Paulician beliefs we find here in France. Interesting. Well, let's keep going down the line here. 1138, there was a work written, I believe the guy's name was Peter the Venerable, wrote a work, I've read some of it in Latin, but in 1138 he wrote a work called Against the Petrobrusians. And the Petrobrusians expressed almost the same belief system as the Paulicians. They did not venerate the cross. They did not believe. And by the way, I do have to point out, if we could go back to the last slide, there was something I skipped that I meant to point out. That one, thank you. When it says they deny the Lord's body and his blood as sacraments, when the Catholic Church accused someone of denying the body and the blood of the Lord, it was typically because they denied transubstantiation. It wasn't that they denied what we would call consubstantiation, or the belief that the Spirit of Christ is in the elements. It's that these people denied the belief that the elements turn into the body and the blood of Christ. Because, Jesus Christ can't be crucified again. Right? I mean, even the writer of Hebrews says they're trying to crucify him all over again. You can't do that. So I do want to point out, when we read history and the Catholic Church says, oh yeah, that group, they deny the body and the blood of the Lord, it's usually because they denied transubstantiation, and the Catholic Church, though, would try to make you look as bad as they possibly could. They'd call you every name in the book. I mean, look at what they did to the Jewish people in the Middle Ages. They accused them of drinking the blood of little infants for Passover. I mean, come on, they would just make up whatever. Fake news is not new, okay? I mean, I'm just saying this. So let's go back to the next slide. So let's talk about the Petrobrusians. And I thought about, I could have taken a picture of a Latin document and put it up here. I didn't have time. But Petrobrusians were accused of denying transubstantiation, denying the veneration of the cross, denying infant baptism, denying the church fathers. They denied the church fathers had any value whatsoever to your salvation. And they believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible. These are all Paulician beliefs. Then in 1139, there was another council that was held. I believe it was what I had intended to put here was what's called the Lateran Council II. Lateran Council II in 1139. The Petrobrusians and another group called the Henricans. Now, Henry was the name of the guy that carried on the work of the Petrobrusians. The Petrobrusians were started by a guy named Peter de Broye. And so he was burned at the stake, and then another guy named Henry took upon himself to continue that work. And they called his followers the Henricans, but they were the same as the Petrobrusians, just under a different name. Now, in 1147, there was a man named Bernard of Clairvaux, and he wrote a letter. Now, this again is in France. He wrote a letter to someone in the church, and here's what he says. This is fascinating. He's talking about the people of France, what's going on in France at this time. And I've got a quote from this letter. He said, the churches are regarded as synagogues. The sanctuary of God is said to have no sanctity. The sacraments are not thought as sacred. The feast days of the Catholic Church are deprived of their wanted solemnities. That's basically another way of saying they weren't being celebrated. So here, this bishop, this guy in the Catholic Church is telling us that the churches in parts of France were being regarded as synagogues because people were beginning to practice things that appeared to be, in their eyes, Judaism. He even claimed that they were stricken with Jewish blindness. This was a common accusation toward people that didn't bow to idols. They were commonly called Jewish. Because people, the second commandment says not to have idols and images of God and things of that nature. And the Catholic Church believed in having images of Jesus and of God and bowing down to them. And, they called them instruments of worship or something of that nature. But these believers did not follow that. Let's go now to the next slide. 1163, the Council of Tours. Where do you think that's at? It's in France. Okay. We're having all these councils in the same region dealing with the same issues. Now, this was convoked by Frederick I. Now, who's Frederick I? Frederick I is who we call Frederick Barbarossa from history. He's one of the most powerful Holy Roman emperors of the Middle Ages. And in Canon 4, he condemns a group called the Albigenses.
This is the first time in history that I can find the term Albigense was ever used. Now, why were they called Albigense? Well, because they lived in a region of southwestern France called Albi. So they called them Albigenses. That's the most commonly accepted explanation. Other explanations sort of fall short, as if maybe there was someone named Albi, though we can't find anyone named Albi, but there's a region named Albi, and these people were very numerous there. Now, let me tell you what this council did to the Albigenses. A person was forbidden from protecting, buying, or selling from them. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Can't buy or sell, right? Revelation 13, does that sound familiar? It actually lists them as infecting many in Gascony and other provinces. Again, Gascony is a region in southwestern France. And this is the first time the term Albigense is ever used in history. In 1167, we have a very important event I want to talk, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but it's interesting because in 1167, there was a man named Nicetas of Constantinople. He was not an Orthodox believer. He was either Paulician or Bogomil. But he holds a council in France with a group of people that are named Cathars, or the Cathari. Now, the word Cathar or Cathari is simply a Latin word. It comes from a Greek word, actually, but it means the pure ones. So let's keep rolling on down through the ages here. 1100s, late 1100s. The Bishop of Josselin of Bordeaux, which is in France, had iconoclastic ideas, and this bishop was rebuked by Pope Alexander III. In 1179, they had something called the Lateran Council, number 3. So there had been 3 Lateran councils up to this time, and it specifically condemns 3 groups of people: the Catharos, the Patrinos, and the Publicanos. Now, the term Publicanos, as we saw just a moment ago, was first used by crusaders to describe Paulicians who were found in the Balkan region. And here we find the same name, the same group being condemned, but these groups are being condemned in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe. And of course we see the Catharos. So these groups are sort of together, but they are still separate groups. So then we come to 1183. 1183. This is the first document I have found that mentions the Waldenses. It's a direct reference to them. They weren't always called Waldenses. They went by a lot of names: the Waldenses, the Valenses, the Valdenses, the Valansians. I mean, they just had all kinds of names. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but basically the term Valensi, Waldense relates to the French word meaning valley dwellers, as they were also. The Vaudois is another name that is used. So, this is a letter from Pope Lucius III, and it's letter 3 against the heretics, and I have a picture. So, I'm going to show you a picture of the Catholic document that first shows the Waldenses. Okay, now you can't read that for multiple reasons. One, it's maybe kind of blurry. Number 2, it's in Latin. Good luck. But we see the title here is number 3, Roman numeral 3. This is a decretum of the Catholic Church, and it says contra hereticos, which means against the heretics. And basically the opening sentence here is saying that we wish to abolish all the different heresies that exist. But let's keep reading, because I want to show you who this was written to. Who was this special decree written to? Basically, idioque nos carissime filii nostri. Okay, so that's what the Latin here on this says. And he goes on to say, basically, to my dear son, Frederick, the illustrious Roman Imperator, Semper Augustus. And he calls him all kinds of big names, fancy. He's just, piling it on him. But this is a special letter written by the Pope, Pope Lucius III, to Frederick I Barbarossa, who he calls his dear son, the illustrious Roman Emperor. Semper Augustus, in Latin, it means always Augustus. Or some translate it forever Augustus. This is a special letter he's writing to him. Now, let's go to the next slide and we'll see. So here's the groups he's asking Frederick to annihilate, to get rid of, to abolish. He lists the Cathoros, the Patorinos, the Humiliatos, and Vel Pauperes de Lugduno. Okay, Vel Pauperes de Lugduno in Latin means the poor of Lyon. Okay, you have to understand when the Catholic Church describes a place in Europe, they describe it based on the ancient Roman name, okay? So Lyon in ancient times was called Lugdunna by the Romans. And Pauperes just means the poor. So he's talking to the poor of Lyon, and this is a direct reference to the Waldenses, the first that I can find in history, because it was another name by which they were called. He also lists, he says, and they go by other names, the Pasaginos, the Josephinos, the Onolistas. And he lists all these different names, and he condemns them to a perpetual damnation. How nice of him. Terrible, actually. So these are the groups that he is describing, they're trying to annihilate the Pasagani, the poor of Lyon, the Catharos, the Patorinos. Now, we don't know a lot about some of these groups, like the Josephinos. There's no J in Latin, by the way, so that's an I. But it's Josephinos is who he's talking about, the Josephinos. We don't know much about them, but we do know some about the other groups. And there were some slight differences, but very much similarities. Let's go on now to the next slide. I want to talk about the Council of Verona, which was in 1184. At this council, that letter, which was written to Frederick, was made a church decree in the presence of the emperor instead of just being a letter. And the same groups were rejected. Now, here were the three main errors the Catholic Church said these groups had. Number one, they rejected the Trinity. That's also a Paulician belief. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They rejected the authority of the church fathers in Rome. And number three, they followed the law of Moses literally. Those were the three things these groups were charged with. Let's now go to 1194, the King of Aragon, which again, we're talking about the Spanish-France border there. And here's what he made a decree, and he said, the heretics should everywhere be rejected, condemned, and persecuted from the face of God and of all Catholics, namely the Waldenses or the Insabati, that is, those who do not observe the Sabbaths or holy days of the Roman Church, who call themselves the poor men of Lyon, and other heretics. So, in this decree, the king is kicking out the Waldenses, who are called the Insabati. Now, there are different theories on why they're called the Insabati, but he's kicking them out of the kingdom, and I think I have listed on the next slide what he does to them. Yes, I do, okay. He called for their goods to be confiscated, and if you even fed them, or you housed them, or you tried to protect them, he basically, in this decree, says, hey, you're free to take all their stuff. You're free to do with them whatever you want. So this is another significant document that proves the existence of the Waldenses at a specific point in time, and shows other names that they were called by, the poor men of Lyon, the Insabati. Some people speculate Insabati refers to a type of shoe they wore. Some people say Insabati refers to the fact they kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Some people say Insabate means they did not keep the Roman Sabbaths, meaning their holy days and festivals. So you got three different theories, and I could pull weighty scholars. The weightiest scholars really are probably on the Sabbath or the anti-Roman side. The shoe theory, I don't know. I've seen a lot of people try to refute that. So a lot of very good refutations. Now let's talk about one of the groups that was mentioned, the Cathari, right? They were mentioned. The Catharos was another name for them. In the 1200s AD, there were books found among the Cathari that belonged to the Bogomils. Books authored by Bogomils found among the Cathari. Well, that's a pretty direct link, isn't it? But also, there were many Cathari who were dualists, who had the Bogomil view of being against the marriage and being against eating meat, and some of them were pacifists and some were not. But also in Western Europe, you had, in 1201 AD, you had the Council of Paris. And at the Council of Paris, 1201 AD, at the Council of Paris, the Valdenses and the Albigenses are condemned, but Bulgaria was curiously mentioned in that council. But then in 1223 at the Council of Paris again, all this is happening in France. It's so interesting. This is Council of Paris. There is a section called Against the Albigenses, and the Catholic Church claimed they had a pope in Bulgaria, Croatia, and Dalmatia, which is basically the Balkan Peninsula. Now, obviously, when you study a little deeper, this is just a weird. They're trying to accuse them of having a pope somewhere, but you didn't have a pope in the Bogomil or Paulician belief system. However, it has been proven by Obolinski and Runtsman that the Bulgarians were people who had migrated to Western Europe and influenced the thinking of these 12th century anti-Catholic, 12th, 13th, 14th century anti-Catholic groups. Now, in the 1200 to 1210 time period, the Waldenses split into two groups. Imagine that. The Waldenses split into a group that was in southeastern France and southern France, and then a second group which is in Lombardy, which was in northern Italy. I think one other thing, I do want to bring up the next slide very quickly. In the late 1240s AD, there was a series of letters between the Pope, Innocent IV, and Frederick II. I don't know where they get the names of some of these popes from, Innocent. It's like they call them the opposite of what they are or something. I don't know. But Pope Innocent was like the least innocent of all. I don't know. But Pope Innocent IV and Frederick II had an exchange of letters, and they discussed how to deal with heretics in France and Italy, especially in Lombardy, and some of the groups that are mentioned, the Catharos, the Patarinos, the Circumcisos, but because they believed in circumcision, the Pasaginos, the Albanenses, the Waldenses. There was 19 groups mentioned, so I just mentioned a few of them, but I mentioned some that we have gone over before. And you'll notice the Catharos and the Pasagani are two groups and the Waldenses are three groups that we've talked about. And I want to show you a map now of where the original Waldenses were between 1000 and 1250 AD. You've got northern Spain, the southern part of France, and some of the northern part of Italy. This is the area where they were mostly found when they were originally dealt with by the Catholic Church. So I come back to a question that we asked yesterday, and that was, were they apostolic? Now, we have to understand that local Christians had existed in France, southern France, since the time of the apostles, or I should have worded that differently, near the time of the apostles. Late first century, late into the second century, we know there were Christians in southern France and northern Italy, no doubt. However, at the same time, we can clearly see that there was an influence on these Western Christians from believers from the East. We can clearly see that. So can we say that they are an unbroken line from the time of the apostles? It'd be really hard to prove that. But we can at the very least say that these were believers who were influenced by groups that are very much older than the documents we have of the Waldenses. The Paulicians, most scholars will agree, the Paulicians go at least back to the 600s AD. So, let's talk about the last thing I want to address, and that is Sabbatarian evidence. Sabbatarian evidence. Were there any Sabbath keepers among these people? And we're going to I've got several quotes. From 1184 to 1210, a man named Bonacursus was a former Cathar, but he converted to Catholicism. And he wrote a book against the Cathars, and he identified one group of them called the Pasagani. Now, recall from the previous slides, the Pasagani was one of the groups the Catholic Church condemned. And he said that they followed the law of Moses to the letter, including the Sabbath. In 1200 AD, Prepostentius of Cremona wrote a work called Summa Contra Hereticos, or Against the Sum of All Heresies. And he attests that the Pasagani, which was a subgroup of Cathars, some people consider the Pasagani a subgroup of Waldenses, that they kept the Sabbath to the letter and observed the dietary laws. I actually have a copy of this work in the Latin language in my car. I have a whole box of books with me, by the way, if anybody wants to read about any of this while we're here. Let's go on to the next one. Moneta of Cremona. He wrote a book against the Cathars and the Valdenses. And in Book 5, Chapter 10, there's a subsection called The Sabbath and the Lord's Day, and he attempts to refute the Pasagani and the Catharis who celebrated the Sabbath. He tries to refute them and explain why they need to keep Sunday instead of Saturday. This, again, is another proof that Sabbatarians were here at this time period. Oh, but that's not all. There's more. In 1267, Pope Clement IV issued a bull against a very large number of Christians that he said had denied the faith and converted to Judaism. Now, sometimes when these popes say that, it's literal, and sometimes it's figurative, okay? Sometimes they would say this if you started keeping the Sabbath or the holy days. They would say, oh, you're just a Judaizer. You know, that's an ancient, and Bill talked about that. That's an ancient argument. It's not a new argument. But there were actually, unfortunately, some people that denied their baptism as a part of that. But that was, again, the minority, and not, I think I have on the next slide some of the reasons. They were called Judaizing Christians because they wanted to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, among other practices that were considered Jewish. Unfortunately, there was a remnant that had renounced their baptism. But again, that was not the majority of the time. That was not the case. In 1285 to 1287, Honorius IV, he condemned Jews and apostates who accepted baptism and continued to practice what they call a Jewish lifestyle. So again, there were Christians who the term apostate is referring to someone who, after their baptism, kept the Sabbath, basically, to keep it short. We're going to read just a few more. I think I got about 3 or 4 more slides here in conclusion. Here's a quote from the papal bull of Honorius IV. Moreover, they invite faithful Christians on every Sabbath and on other festivals to their homes. They urge them in their synagogues to participate in their worship and to practice it with them according to their rites, to bow their knee before the Torah. Thus very many Christians Judaize with them. So that's a quote that where Honorius is condemning these Christians. And I think I have another quote from I sort of sped up in time here. The 1450s, there was a work by an inquisitor an inquisitor is someone who works with the Inquisition of the Catholic Church. An inquisitor to Bohemia wrote a work called Against the Valdesier and Catharer. That is a Germanized version of Valdenses and Cathari, and here's what he talks about. He talks about a subgroup called the Picardians, and he calls them impious and pharisaical, a false abomination. Now, he says many of them honored Sunday, but they did not honor any of the festivals of the saints. They did not honor Mary, which is just like the Paulicians. However, he said not a few of them celebrate the Sabbath of the Jews. So there were a good number of Sabbatarians among the Picardians. And I think the last quote I have, Gretzer, who was a German Jesuit who accused the Waldenses in the late 1500s, the early 1600s, and also Bishop Usher from Ireland are in agreement that the Waldenses were called Insabbati because they honored the Jewish Sabbath, calling Saturday the Lord's Day. So we have thus reviewed in the last 2 sessions the historical origins or potential historical origins. Obviously, there's probably other things we could have brought in, but the fact that the Waldenses are not likely some kind of unpure strain of a pure strain of unbroken apostolic succession from the early days to now, but rather there were a group of Christians who were identified as Catholic already in France and Italy that became influenced by Christians from the East who were very evangelistic and sought to spread their beliefs as far as they possibly could. And the evidence we've gone over today very much points to this as the most likely possibility. I went 3 minutes over. But. Questions?
Kelly, a few slides back you had a map.
Yes, sir.
And it was along southern France and spread east toward the northern part of Italy. A number of years ago, I did a long, wrote a really long article on the Galatians, on the book of Galatians. And I got this idea in thinking about where the Galatians were and come to determine it was an area, not a city, nor was it a congregation, but it was an area in Asia Minor. And I asked Steve Collins, I called Steve Collins, and I asked him because he had written about the Galatians moving, the Gauls moving all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, if they ever migrated back. And he said, absolutely. And they did migrate all the way back to Asia Minor. And the Gauls are associated with the northern tribes. And so that map sort of confirms, I think, what he had...
We bring the map, it's on slide 38.
What he had said, because what you're seeing is you're having this group of people that are called Waldenses, I guess you're saying, but apparently Sabbath keepers, and they're spreading across that whole area that Steve Collins said the Gauls migrated back across to Asia Minor, actually back and forth. They basically occupy that whole area and never really left. So
yeah,
it's quite
it is true
interesting.
that there are Greek historians that say a group called the Gauls did migrate into what we call the country of Turkey in the 200s BC, and then those same Gauls we find in France. Yes, that's historically accurate. So.
I just wanted to be sure that I'm understanding you. You brought a recent point about Lyon, the poor of Lyon,
Yes.
was a reference to the Waldenses. And I'm not sure if I made my notes right, but you have, they were called in the Jewish lifestyle.
Yeah.
And I may have mixed it up, but when you're saying called in the Jewish lifestyle, did that mean they were observing the feast days and the holy days, circumcision and everything, or?
To answer the question, okay, so first of all, not all the Waldenses kept Sabbath, okay? Because we looked at the Picardians, for instance, they had Sunday keepers among them, but there were Sabbath keepers among them as well. So what you would find among because a lot of these groups, the Catholic Church just called them a general name, like you're the Cathari. And there were really like 10 groups, though, but they called them all Cathari or Waldenses. And so what you probably had were subsects, like heading Church of God. You would find, CGI and this group and that United. You had different, but they're under heading. So you would have Waldense or Cathar, and underneath it you would have the Pasagani, who kept the 10 Commandments and the dietary laws, or the Circumcisos, who probably did the same thing, but then also circumcised as well. I don't know that any of these groups kept the annual Sabbaths. I've not found any evidence of that. However, there's some there was a couple of references to them, some of these groups keeping the festivals, but we don't know how long they did. We don't know, how many of them did. Those references are not nearly as common as Sabbath or circumcision or something of that nature. Those are actually pretty common, more common references than the holy days. Even the dietary laws aren't found a lot. But so to answer your question, basically, it's probably there were subgroups under the heading Waldense or Cathari, and there were a variety. But they sort of seemed to get along with each other because they lived in a similar area.
Poor of Lyon that were referred to as the Waldenses. So did they specifically target the poor?
Okay.
And call them these names?
I can tell you where the Catholic Church got that name from. So, as we talked about yesterday, the Catholic Church believes the Waldenses started in 1170 with a man named Peter Waldo. If we read the writings of Guido of Carmelita, who lived at the end of the 1200s, early 1300s AD, he says that in 1170, Peter Waldo took a vow of poverty. And he sold everything he had over a period of time. Apparently, he was a pretty wealthy guy. He sold everything he had over a period of time in order to perfect himself by the evangelizing of the gospel, as Guido words it in the Latin. And so they became known as the poor men of Lyon simply sort of on the basis of a precedent. I can't say that all the Waldenses practiced vows of poverty, but there were some of the groups mentioned, such as the Humiliatos and some of the Cathari. The Cathari had a echelon of people. The top Cathari people were called the perfectos, or the perfecti, and they all had to take a vow of poverty, and the rest of the Cathari paid for their expenses. They weren't allowed to have a job. They could only go preach. That was all. They were supposed to sort of live off the land, live off what people gave them, etc. So not all of them were poor, because I can show you from history there were counts and barons. There were people with big, I'm talking about landowners in southern France, who supported Waldenses, Cathars, and Albigenses. In fact, they fought an entire crusade over it called the Albigensian Crusade, which was from 1208 to 1229 AD. And basically, the wealthy landowners of southern France fought against the more wealthy landowners of northern France, but it took them 20-something years to subdue them because they supported these groups. And so they weren't all poor. They were just given that name because Waldo, who the Catholic Church considers to be their progenitor, he took a vow of poverty. So that sort of a roundabout way of answering.
I was just going to add one more thing to what I was saying before. I thought about, and that is, if you look at that group of people across there, and if they were indeed the Gauls, and they moved over to, and they had expanded prior to that over to Asia Minor, and had gone back, then the people of the Galatia, the Galatians, in Hebrew the word Galatian would be pronounced or be spelled with a gimel lamed and a tav, and it would be galut, and galut in Hebrew means exiles.
Oh wow, fascinating. That's amazing. I think you got some people behind you.
When the Waldensians were finally overcome by the Roman army,
yes,
and they pushed them.
Switzerland.
There was one cave where there was a couple thousand people. The Romans, these people hid in this cave in the mountain, and the Romans come up and sealed the cave, and they all died inside that cave.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
But eventually, they drove the Waldensians out of that area, and they settled in another part of France, out of the hill, out of the mountain area. But they eventually then just adopted the basically Protestant concepts.
Yeah, the Waldenses are spread all over Europe by the 1500s. In fact, George Morel says there was about 800,000 in 1530. However, there was a great concentration in southern France and Italy in what we call the Piedmont Valley, which is where the line is between Italy and France. And those groups were greatly reduced by persecutions to just a few thousand from tens of thousands. And they ended up migrating into Switzerland, and they became basically Calvinist and recanted a lot of their beliefs. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about that in light of, and I wanted to, just as a point of interest, Kelly, ask, what is your take on the Jesuits and the part they played in all of this on behalf of the Catholic Church?
Sure, yeah. So the Jesuits were started, at the time of the beginning of the Reformation, or just anterior to it, as sort of a militant counter-Reformation movement. And what the Jesuits would do is they would go into a church, for instance, and they would cause division and cause that church to split. They would hunt down leaders and kill them. In fact, there were times the Pope had to issue decrees to stop the Jesuits because they were being so militant, so bad even the Pope had to stop them. Imagine that, right? Those are not good guys in and of themselves. But so the Jesuits were used by the inquisitors, and the Jesuits were the chameleons. They would go in and act like they were a Cathari or a Waldense, and they would gather information. Who's the important people? Where are the guards at? Where are the fortifications at? Where do they keep the weapons? They would do all this intelligence gathering and then thus report back to the Catholic Church. And then the Catholic Church would either try to hold a trial against the people or attack them with various armies. And so, yeah, the Jesuits, in fact, Gretzer, I mentioned earlier, who was one of the Jesuits that persecuted them, he was one that said they kept the seventh-day Sabbath. And so to answer your question, yes, the Jesuits were instrumental. And in fact, the reason why the Waldenses of the Piedmont Valley fell prey to the Romans is because some of the Catholic forces promised them a treaty of peace if they would let them in the city, and actually that's not what happened. Once they got into the city, they were able to scope out where the weak points were in the walls of the cities, some of the various cities they had, and they broke through them, and they committed such terrible crimes against the Waldenses that the King of England sent a guy named Samuel Morland to write a book about it in the 1600s.
Just a point of clarification on your take on the Valdenses. If I am understanding you correctly, you're saying that that's kind of a all-encompassing label or term that covers quite a few other subgroups, but are you also in addition saying in parallel to that that there was a legitimate Valdensian group that was carrying that name and they were Sabbath keepers or not?
Sure. Yes. So the term Waldensi and Cathari and Albigensi were all three sort of headings. Yes, they could be used as broad headings, but there was a specific group called Waldenses, which had among them Sabbatarians. It's hard to say a percentage. You know, Ellen G. White would say they were all Sabbatarians. The Waldenses today would say none of them were Sabbatarians, but the evidence said they had Sabbatarians among them. So it's probably the most historically accurate way to say it, is that there were Sabbath keepers among the Waldenses. Some of the literature I've read suggests that some Waldenses didn't keep any day as holy, based on the misinterpretation of Romans 14. But we know that there were Waldenses among that specific group that did keep the Sabbath. So, but the term Waldensi, it's kind of like the term, the Waldenses would call people Arian. I'm not the Waldenses. The Catholic Church would call people Arian. 1,000 years after Dr. Arius, they were still calling people Arians. It was just sort of a general way to denigrate someone or put them under a heading. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, Waldensi was both specific and generic, and there were Sabbatarians among them.
Just a quick question. What kind of access do you find that these groups had to the scriptures, which might give us some reason to understand how they came to some of their conclusions? Or do you think it was more from word of mouth, or did they have scriptures? We know they memorized scriptures, so somehow they had access. Do you know what kind?
So some of the Waldenses in the 1200s had a copy of the Bible in their own language, the Romance language. But it's hard to say if every group of Waldenses, because again, the Waldenses eventually evangelized all of Europe, and you can find pockets of Waldenses all over Europe in the 1600s. And that's where some of the variation in belief comes, is because you might have a group here, maybe they don't have all the Bibles, so they're not practicing the Sabbath, or they're not practicing this or that or the other. But they all knew not to practice what the Catholic Church was teaching, so it was kind of something they all had in common. But there were some groups of Waldenses that only had the book of Job, you know, so it's really hard to say what, but there were definitely, some of them did have the whole Bible in their own language, and that's one of the reasons why the Catholic Church took a vested interest in hating them, because they did not want the lay people to have the Bible in their own language. They wanted to keep it in Latin so everybody doesn't understand it, and so that you have to go to a priest, so you have to go through them in order to understand the Bible. So to answer your question, it's kind of an unknown element. We know the Paulicians had access at least to most of the New Testament. They didn't always have the book of Acts or the book of Revelation. Now, the Waldenses a lot of times appealed to the book of Revelation in some of their exegesis and some of their eschatology. So at some point in their history, they did have access to the book of Revelation, because they called the Pope the Antichrist, and the Catholic Church the whore that rides the beast. So you would not have those references unless you had the Bible. Hope that answers your question, kind of. So it's sort of an unknown quantity. I mean, some of them did have parts. Some of them probably had most of the Bible.
Kelly, about the premise for your entire discussion here that you've done as far as the Waldensians, my understanding is that you're trying to show that there is or is not an unbroken line of succession from, I guess, from the disciples all the way down through today. Is that correct?
The answer is I don't know.
Okay, but you don't know, but you don't know if there is or not.
I'm saying that the Waldenses, as a people group living in southern France and northern Italy, it can't be proven, in my opinion, that that a group of people in that one locale go all the way back to the original apostles with the same belief system. What I tried to show is that there were people groups that did live there that accepted the gospel message, but they were influenced from the East, which was an older belief, so we can prove that was an older belief system. And there is a possibility that the Paulicians do go back to the apostles. There's a possibility, I believe, there, but it's really hard to prove that.
But are you aware that the rabbis teach that there is an unbroken line of succession and authority from Moses all the way down through the first century, and that's what they use to give themselves authority to, like for instance, write the oral
Like
commandments,
Talmud?
the Talmud, the
Mishnah?
fences around the law.
Interesting.
And it seems like people seem to be all eaten up with the desire to claim their ordination came all the way back from some previous authority,
Yeah.
and that enables them. Is that what you're? I mean, you think that's something that's?
I don't think it's. Let me say this: even if the Paulicians could be proven to go back to apostolic times, it is impossible to prove that there's an unbroken line of ordained individuals from, let's just say, the early apostles to now. It's impossible to prove that. Number one, because you can't prove who was ordained by Polycrates going from Christ, and you have swaths of hundreds of years where you don't have the names of the, like we studied some of the names, like the Pasaganos and the Waldenses. Well, we don't have all the ministers that there were there. So no, I believe that God doesn't need an apostolic succession because he operates by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and the same Spirit of Jesus Christ that was in the early apostles is in us, and that makes us automatically have an apostolic connection. So, yeah, I know some people, when I started this research, were concerned I was going to try to, and this is a legitimate concern, try to establish an apostolic succession. That's not what I'm trying to do at all. I believe it's impossible scholastically. So if somebody wants to make up and say that there's an apostolic succession, they're welcome to do that, but they would be making it up. So, unless they can show 200 and something individuals with names and dates and primary source proof that they lived in all these time periods, which we don't have any records, so it'd be impossible to do that. So,
You briefly mentioned something. I lived in Germany for 4 years, and you mentioned something about the Aries and then calling them the Aryans. And I'm wondering if that's a possibility that you can bring that name forward to actually the Hitlerian times and his persecution of the others, because he believed the Aries or the Aryan race was the right race. You had to be an Aryan, to live.
So two different things there. So the term Arian, as I use it, Arius, comes from a guy named Dr. Arius in the 300s AD that taught that God was not a Trinity. We are not 100% sure what Dr. Arius taught, but he definitely was not Trinitarian. So that's where the term Arian comes from in ecclesiastical history. The term Arian that Hitler used, A-R-Y-A-N, is different than A-R-I-A-N, which I'm using A-R-I-A-N. A-R-Y-A-N was a belief system that some of the Germanic people were descended from, had this pure strain of a descent from the Middle East. That's why Hitler did a lot of excavations in the Middle East to try and prove, for instance, the Nazi symbol, okay, it's an Indian symbol from ancient India. You can buy coins from ancient art dealers and coin dealers with coins from India that have the Nazi symbol. So he borrowed some symbology from ancient times and did a lot of, they would even make up some of their own archaeological excavations in addition to that. So I would say there's probably not any connection between Dr. Arius from ancient times and the Hitler promoting the Aryan race theory. So none that I've ever seen. It would be hard to, because Hitler was not talking about a ecclesiastical ideology. Hitler was talking about an ideology of race, which is a completely separate concept. To my knowledge, the Aryans never, the A-R-I-A-N, the Aryans that were religious believers never made any kind of claim that a certain race was superior to another. Does that answer your question? Well, that's true.
As his guise for, the genocide of the Jews and so forth.
Well, the Aryans from ancient times were known to be very beneficial to the Jewish people. You look at the reign of Theodoric I from about the 490s into the 520s AD. Theodoric, who was an Aryan, was very benevolent to the Jewish people. So Aryans historically, from that time period, as far as church belief system, were very kind to the Jewish people and fellowshiped to some degree or another with Jewish people. But it is, I will say, as an interesting aside, that many of the Germanic tribes became Aryan in the 500s AD. But I still don't think there's a connection, that I've seen. But if I stand to be corrected if there's evidence.
Well, the original Arian was a deacon from Egypt at the Council of Nicaea.
Dr. Arius.
And
yeah.
he was, like you said, he didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. But his big problem was the Quanto de Seminary controversy. He believed in keeping the Passover. And Constantine wanted to change it to Easter. And that's when he was expelled from the church at the time. And then, like you mentioned there, eventually come into Central Europe. They even sacked Rome later. That same group of were Germanic tribes that
That's right, the
sacked
Vandals,
Rome
the
were
Visigoths.
part of the Arian
Absolutely.
group. But Arian himself was a deacon from the Egyptian church that was at the council.
Alexandria. He was from the region of Alexandria.
Yeah, and he was at the Council of Nicaea.
That's right. Yep, they banished Arius and his followers. But did you know Constantine was baptized by an Arian before he died? All right, last question, and then we're going to eat. How about that?
I was just going to comment that if I understand it, Arius did believe that Yeshua or Jesus was the Son of God.
Yes.
He just didn't believe that he existed before, and that he believed that he was created by the one God. He didn't deny that Yeshua was the Son of God. He just denied that they were
That he was God.
They're co-equal. Well, he denied that they were he existed in the past, and he was
a created being.
Yeah, but he was a created being, but still part of. He was really truly the Son of God, and there are still Arians today.
Yeah, there's an Arian Catholicism,
Yeah.
actually. Yes, to clarify, Arianism, now we don't have any writings of Arius because they were all burned at Nicaea. However, to the best of our knowledge, as we study the opponents of Arianism, it appears Dr. Arius and some of his followers believed Jesus was a created being. They use the verse where it says he was God's only begotten son to say, well, if he was from eternity, how could he be begotten? That was their argument. Without, of course, you'd have to skip John 1:1 and the rest of that to come to that conclusion. But so they did believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They just did not believe he was an eternal being equal with God, and they definitely were not Trinitarian. But that's going off of what their opponents say. So, I mean, but to the best of our knowledge, yes, what Dr. Merritt's saying is correct. So I think that's the last question we've got time for right now. I went a little bit over, but we can ask questions over lunch. How about that? Are they ready? Or all right. She's about, yeah, I've been ready. I did go a little over on the question and answer. I apologize. All right, so I'm going to say a blessing and we'll eat. Great God in heaven above, we just thank you so much for the Bible Sabbath Association and this special conference we've been able to have, and how we've been able to enjoy a time of fellowship and enlightenment and encouragement and empowerment, and that we've just been able to glorify your name and to worship you in spirit and in truth this weekend. It has truly been a blessing. We thank you for the food that you have provided for us, and we pray, God, right now you bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies and our service of you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.